Chapter 1279 Sense of Urgency Apocalypse. Although Audrey had long learned about the prophecy of the apocalypse from the Church of Knowledge and Wisdom demigod, she never found it corporeal enough, feeling that it was meant to deceive the people. Even though she had already slightly experienced a war where the individual was puny, she didn't believe that the world was just about a decade away from the apocalypse. There were no signs of this at all. However, the person who had given the apocalyptic prophecy was Mr. Fool's Blessed, Mr. World, who had always been trustworthy in daring to strike at angels. Furthermore, his tone was firm, as though he had already seen what was about to happen a decade later. This made Audrey choose to instinctively believe him. Her heart sank as she felt nervous and flustered. Apart from that, she also felt her confusion fade significantly. There was still another decade before the end of the world. Even those who were drowning would struggle a little, much less a perfectly fine sequence for demigod. Apocalypse. As a cardinal of the Church of Storms, Alger had recently seen many apocalyptic prophecies, but those unverifiable matters couldn't compare to the World Gehrman Sparrow's abnormally serious warning. The impact brought by the two sources wasn't on the same level. At the same time, he acutely noticed a detail: the world said that even deities would be destroyed. Alger's first reaction was that Gehrman Sparrow was being disrespectful to Mr. Fool, as Mr. Fool was also a deity. However, he quickly rejected this idea. After all, the World Gehrman Sparrow was Mr. Fool's Blessed and was the most devout believer. The other members of the Tarot Club might accidentally blaspheme Mr. Fool, but it was impossible for the World Gehrman Sparrow. Due to the two prerequisites that Gehrman Sparrow wouldn't be disrespectful to Mr. Fool and him saying that even deities would be destroyed, Alger quickly came to another conclusion: in the world's Gehrman Sparrow's heart, Mr. Fool's level was higher than that of a true deity. Alger never doubted the World Gehrman Sparrow's knowledge. After all, he was a powerhouse who often interacted with angels. This knowledge made him both shocked and puzzled, momentarily unable to find an even more reasonable explanation. Having used the blood of a snake of fate to advance to the level of a demigod, Katlia would also occasionally dream of the scene of the dawn of the apocalypse thanks to her pathway having clairvoyant as its sequence 3. In addition, Queen Mystic Bernadette would occasionally remind her, so she didn't feel any surprise or shock regarding Mr. World's words. She just felt like the dust that had been stirred had finally landed on the ground. As for the future, this mysticologist was equally lost. Apart from improving herself, she didn't know where to direct her efforts. Apocalypse. Zio and Furs looked at each other across Mam Hermit and sensed the raging upheavals in each other's hearts. They had never thought that the wonderful life they were living wouldn't last more than 2 decades unless something happened. This was a time where they were in their prime. Even if they weren't demigods, they didn't have to worry about the inclination towards losing control due to their aging bodies. As the person who spoke was the World Gehrman Sparrow, the two ladies didn't suspect the authenticity of the prophecy. They momentarily felt fearful and heavy. At the beginning, Derek couldn't help but feel depressed. This was because the City of Silver had just left the forsaken land of the gods and came to the world of light. Yet, none of this would last long before the apocalypse was ushered in. Soon, he composed himself and chose to believe in Mr. Fool. Since this great existence was able to rescue the City of Silver from the forsaken land of the gods, he, too, could also stop the apocalypse. Although I'm the savior of the sanguine during the apocalypse, I never expected it to happen so soon. I'm only an earl. Emlyn couldn't help but frown. It was as though a student who had just attended a few days of lessons had to suddenly sit an exam. Of course, this also made him excited. After all, it wouldn't be long before he would fulfill his mission and display his greatness in front of his fellow kinsmen. Leonard had heard of the doomsday prophecy from Old Man Palaz Zoroast. Although he didn't know the reason behind such a development, he had long been mentally prepared. At this moment, he was the first to snap back to his senses and asked, why would the apocalypse suddenly happen? There are no signs of it, Klein controlled the world to reply. it's just that you didn't notice the signs. Do you think that a battle of gods erupted for no reason? Seeing that all the members of the Tarot Club were stunned and lost in thought, the World Gairman Sparrow added, "You aren't qualified to know the exact reason. Just understanding it would bring about an irrepressible corruption. Only angels and above can resist it. This is similar to what the demigod from the Church of Knowledge's demigod said. It's close to the corruption from the cosmos. I seem to have forgotten something. Mr. World seems to have figured out the whole story. Isn't he afraid of being corrupted? He's already an angel? He is now a he." Thoughts flashed through Audrey's mind as she acutely sensed that the World Gairman Sparrow might have completed his advancement and become a true mythical creature. In ancient times, this could even be called a subsidiary god, a member of the deity lineup. Right on the heels of that, Alger, Catlia, and the other members of the Tarot Club understood the truth. They knew that the World Gairman Sparrow had already reached the top of the real world, becoming an angel that walked the land. Their guesses were related to Gairman Sparrow's plan to deal with a mythical creature. Some believed that it was the benefits that Mr. Fool's recovery gave to his blessed. But no matter what, it was the first time the Tarot Club had a member at the level of an angel, aside from its host and convener. Of course, they weren't too surprised by the World Gairman Sparrow's advancement to Sequence 2. They had long been numb to his progression rate. Klein controlled the world and made him look around. "You can think about what you plan to do next and how you would go about doing it." Zio, Furs, and the other Tarot Club members nodded slightly as acknowledgement. Another 10 minutes of free exchange followed before this session of the tarot gathering gradually came to an end. After returning to the real world, Zio surveyed her bedroom. Her expression slowly turned solemn. She once again felt a pressing sense of urgency. After walking out of the room, Zio saw that Furs had also walked out to the corridor at the same time. She no longer suffered from momentary paralysis before coming out. "Where do you plan on going?" both of them asked in unison before falling silent. A few seconds later, a handsome young man walked out of the guest room. He wore a pair of narrow-framed spectacles and had slightly fluffy hair. He held a few thick books in both hands. "Oh no, I forgot that I have classes this afternoon." The youth mumbled to himself as he rushed towards the staircase, completely ignoring the presence of the two ladies. He was Zio's younger brother, Rio Dericha. He had just entered a pre-law school. In Backlund, one had to pass a pre-law examination before becoming a paralegal. Such a paralegal had to study and work for at least 5 years under a full lawyer before one was allowed to take part in the qualification examination and get a license to practice law. If one wanted to become a senior lawyer, one had to enter the Backlund Lawyer School to receive university-level education. Zio watched her little brother run down the stairs, and a smile subconsciously appeared on her face. She immediately looked up and said to Furs, "I plan to return to MI9 and work hard." "I plan on making a trip to Teacher's Place," Furs answered the question. Right on the heels of that, the traveler's figure quickly turned transparent and vanished. A few seconds later, Furs appeared at a relatively intact building in the rebuilding Pritz Harbor. Then, she took out a pen and paper from her pocket and wrote a note. She planned on telling her teacher that she had finished digesting the traveler potion. Putting away the fountain pen, she stuffed the paper into the mailbox at the door. This wasn't Dorian Gray Abraham's residence. It was the place where Furs and the gentleman had previously agreed to send letters to. The next day, when Furs arrived, she saw Dorian providing her with the meeting location and time. Emlyn opened his eyes in his room and changed into his coat with a standing collar, intending to visit Marquis Nibs. When the carriage passed Rose Street, he subconsciously looked out the window and was somewhat surprised to discover that the door to the Harvest Church had opened. After a brief hesitation, he got the carriage driver to stop the carriage, and he paid for the ride. After putting on his top hat and holding his cane, the red-eyed Sanguine Earl walked up the steps and entered the Harvest Church. He saw Father Yatravsky, who seemed to have grown a little taller, cleaning the prayer hall with his back hunched. He has been released as expected. It really was protective custody. Emlyn shook his head inwardly. At this moment, Father Yatravsky raised his head and looked at him. "Wipe the candle stand, I'm trying to please Mother Goddess," Emlyn mumbled. He walked to the room behind him, changed into the brown priest robe of the Church of Earth Mother, and began working. Neither of them spoke a word. They did their own jobs and tried their best to restore the Harvest Church to its former cleanliness and tranquility. After an unknown period of time, a group of people suddenly entered the door. Emlyn subconsciously looked over and saw Baron Kosmiodora. He saw Viscount Ernst Boyar, who had once worked at the Harvest Church, and many familiar faces. Emlyn's lips subconsciously curled up. Chapter 1280 Chance meeting in the tiny city on a steam locomotive heading for Mid-Seashire's Constant City. Klein, who was dressed as a wandering magician, looked at the young man and his parents across the narrow table with items placed on it. "I have two types of magic tricks. The first is to let your wishes come true. The second is to use a mirror to answer your question. Of course, the first type of magic requires payment, and the second requires you to answer questions posed by the mirror. What kind of performance do you want to watch?" The young man had black hair and brown eyes. He seemed to have received a good education. He looked at his parents sitting beside him and said with a smile, "My wish is too difficult, so I won't trouble you. In comparison, I'm more curious about the mirror that can answer questions." Klein sighed as he shook his head. With a flip of his left hand, he revealed a silver mirror with a black gem on both sides. "It seems to be an antique." The young man opposite him commented with piqued interest before saying, "My question is, what is the purpose of my visit to Constant City?" A commonly seen smile, one which was often seen on the faces of street magicians, appeared on Klein's face as he stroked the surface of the mirror with his right hand and said in a serious tone, "Mirror, mirror, please tell me the answer to the question." After repeating it 3 times, he released his right hand and showed the surface of the mirror to the 3 passengers. There were a few silver words on it, "To get married." Amazing. The young man and his parents looked at each other in disbelief. After boarding the train, they had never mentioned anything related to the wedding, nor did they reveal anything that people could use to make the connection. This was the first time they had seen a magic trick that didn't rely on props or a fake audience. "All right, it's time for the mirror to ask." Klein smiled as he covered the surface of the mirror with his right hand. "All right." The young man replied, feeling intrigued. Visit website Our List Novel. Next, let's see what question the magic mirror will raise. Klein released his right hand in an exaggerated manner as though he was performing a formal magic trick. The silver words on the surface of the mirror had already changed, extending into a complete sentence. "You would prefer your bride to be a woman in her 40s or above, right?" The young man's expression froze for a moment before turning pale and then completely red. "How is that possible?" he immediately rebutted. He couldn't help but turn his head to look at his parents and grumble, "What kind of strange question is that? It's just kidding." Klein smiled apologetically as he hurriedly pressed his right hand onto the surface of the mirror, as though he didn't know that would happen. Then, he released his right hand. Indeed, the words on the mirror changed again. "How old are you?" 25 years old, the young man replied carefully, afraid that he would fall into a trap. He felt the gazes of his parents and the surrounding passengers on him change. "All right, that's the end of the magic performance." Klein smiled as he put away the mirror. "You can try another magic trick." Just as he finished speaking, the steam locomotive whistled. This was the sign that it was about to enter the station. "Sorry, that's my call." Klein took out his golden pocket watch and checked the time. He carried his luggage and left the steam locomotive along with a group of passengers. He arrived at the station platform that had yet to be lit up with the gas lamps. This was mid-Seashire's Belton City, a city that had both prospered and declined due to the coal mines. To Klein, the greatest significance of this place was that it was a strategic node in the previous World War. Faysac had taken 3 routes in its invasion. One attacked the border along the Amantha mountain range to break through the land defenses. Another involved setting off from Sonia Island, attacking the coastal harbors, and attempting a landing. The third was to follow the main railway as they marched towards Backlund for the invasion. Among them, due to the existence of the Church of Storms and the combined might of the ironclad warships and high-level arbiters, the naval forces of Faysac and Fainapotter failed to obtain the results they expected. They even failed to obtain naval superiority. And on the battlefields on the Amantha mountain range, the headquarters of the Church of Evernight blocked one wave after another. It didn't fall throughout the war, thus preventing Winter County and Eastchester County from going through the fiery crucible of war. Of the 3 routes, the only successful one was the mid-Seashire troops. They did a joint naval land operation and conquered Lone's second biggest city, Constant City, the capital of mid-Seashire. Then, they made their way southeast, rendezvousing with the Intis troops in the greater area of Backlund. Klein acted as a wandering magician. On the one hand, he had to accumulate wishes, display miracles, digest the potion, and increase his strength. On the other hand, he was planning on taking the path of the war, using his eyes, ears, and his soul to truly see the damage brought about by war. After knowing the secrets of the cosmos and the underground, he could understand the Evernight goddess's plan and accept it to a certain extent. However, this didn't mean that he was indifferent to the sacrifices. At the same time, he confirmed one thing: even if he didn't stop George III from becoming the Black Emperor, the World War would have still erupted. However, Lone would have had the upper hand. The Evernight goddess and her allies would face the god of combat head-on, forcing him to seek help from Earth Mother. When that happened, the number of battles between the gods, the intensity, and scale would far surpass what had transpired. Due to this reason, Klein followed Faysac's invasion path and wandered forward. After leaving the station that still had traces of gunpowder, he carried the worn suitcase with a set of clothes and made his way towards the area where hotels were located. At night, he would stroll along the streets and alleys of the city and perform wishing magic for everyone. After taking a few steps forward, Klein's spiritual perception stirred as he cast his gaze to the end of the street. There was a black-haired woman wearing a simple linen robe and a tree bark belt with no socks or shoes. Ariana. The leader of the Church of Evernight Ascetics, the grounded angel, Ariana. Why would she be here in Belton? Shouldn't she have returned to the Evernight cloister at the Cathedral of Serenity? Or be sent to the Faysac capital, St. Millum, to preside over the handing over of the god of combat's estate? It isn't a simple matter if a grounded angel were to suddenly appear in such a small city. Klein was puzzled as he frowned slightly. He hesitated for a moment before deciding to ask. This wasn't because he was a busybody. If anything happened while they were in the same city, no one could escape. However, at this moment, Ariana had already vanished from the crowd. As a servant of concealment, Klein couldn't track her down even if he wanted to. Similarly, when it came to the matter of concealment, Rhodes was helpless. Klein slowly took a deep breath and turned to enter the hotel in thought. He got a room and stowed his luggage away. Then, he maintained his attire as a wandering magician and brought Rhodes along with him. Following his spiritual intuition as a seer, he walked all the way to the municipal square of Belton City. Erected near the municipal hall was a notice board that had many notices pasted over it. Klein saw that several people surrounded it. There seemed to be a brand new notice, so he approached them and stood in the periphery of the crowd, looking at the wooden signboard. In the middle of the signboard, a slightly yellowed piece of paper covered over the other notices. On the surface were black ink and Loanese writing: "Ladies and gentlemen, I am your new consul. Now, I will issue 3 new laws. First law, without my permission, no living being can leave this place. Second law, all life is equal in front of the law. Even ordinary people can kill angels. Third law, those who commit the crimes mentioned below will be punished severely. The highest penalty being the death sentence. 1. Murder, 2. Theft, 3. Chanting the complete honorific name of a deity, 4. Offering sacrifices to evil deities, 5. Fraud, 6. Leaking secrets, an announcement like this. Klein pricked up his brows when he saw this. Without using his spiritual intuition, he could sense that there was something wrong with the content. He instinctively tried to make his spirit body return to Sapphira Castle. But an invisible force blocked his departure, making it impossible for him to make contact with the grayish-white fog. This. Klein narrowed his eyes as he took a few steps back to distance himself from the crowd. From his point of view, an abnormality of this level had reached a near-deity level. He had previously been in situations of not being able to return to Sapphira Castle, but the reason was that he didn't have the time to take 4 steps counterclockwise, recite the incantations, or he had been obstructed and interfered by himself. There was only one instance when he failed to leave the real world due to external forces. It was a powerful seal personally created by the Evernight goddess in the foggy town. Apart from that instance, even blasphemer Amon couldn't do such a thing. Of course, at that time, Amon's main goal was to force Klein to stir Sapphira Castle before he seized the opportunity to use a loophole to replace him as the great ruler above the spirit world. Otherwise, this angel of time could have used his ability to steal Klein's thoughts to stop him from returning. Who is this new consul of Belton City? Is this the reason Ma'am Ariana came here? As his thoughts raced, Klein made the magic mirror slip from his wide sleeve into his left hand. What happened? Klein asked softly. The aqueous light on the silver mirror's surface shook wildly as slightly pale silver words appeared. A few rules here have been replaced. As for who did it, there's no way of knowing. Great Master, you can try finding the servant of concealment, Ariana, to learn the truth from her. Are you satisfied with my answer? The rules have been replaced. Lawyer? Arbiter? Or a bug? Klein thought as he looked around. He realized that the citizens in the square were puzzled, perplexed as to why the new notice would mention angels. Why did they have to request permission to leave? The war had already ended. Chapter 1281 Anomaly inside a bar in Belton City. Roy, Biles, Phil, and Pasha sat around a small round table, guzzling down Southville beer. They didn't talk much as they listened to the drunkards in the next table discussing supernatural powers and mysticism incidents. Before this, I saw that, not only do the Phasacians look like bears, but they could also control fire, throwing them out like javelins. No way. Supernatural powers actually exist? That's because you don't know a thing. I was drunk one day and slept near the cemetery. I saw people from the Church of Evernight appear with a few ghosts out. Yes, ghosts. They floated in the air, and it was terrifying. It was unknown if the drunkards were sharing stories from personal experiences or from hearsay, but the way they described it was with so much agitation that saliva kept flying as their faces flushed red. That's what they're like. They only become more excited after drinking. They always like to brag and be dramatic despite usually being depressed. Biles was a Belton local. Upon seeing this, he explained, ever since the coal mines began to run dry, young people gradually left Belton and headed for Constant and Backlund. The atmosphere here has become more and more oppressive, and the city is just declining by the day. This man, who was less than 30 years old, had also been a miner when he was young. He was lucky to survive in the mines. His skin was tanned from all the labor. His exposed muscles weren't too exaggerated, but it gave people the feeling that they were made of steel. As the leader of the group, Roy smiled and said, "What they're saying might be the truth. They're not bragging. The previous war has indeed exposed supernatural powers to many people, especially the soldiers who were directly involved. As long as they're still alive, they will have the corresponding experience. Besides, this also brings about many fortuitous encounters, making it so that people who had zero chance of interacting with supernatural powers or true mysticism to become beyonders." The way he expressed himself was very subtle, as though he was talking about others, but in reality, this was exactly what the four of them had experienced. Biles and Roy had participated in the defense of Belton City before. Phil had once been ransacked by the Phasacians, but he was lucky to not have died. Pasha and her former citizens had seduced and ambushed a few Inta soldiers in the harbor battle. They had witnessed the deaths of many of their friends and obtained supernatural powers due to various reasons. After that, due to the chaos brought about by the war, they either lost contact with their unit, or they avoided it on their own accord without the officials learning about it. Slowly, they got to know each other and became friends with each other due to their common experiences. This time, they had come to Biles's hometown in Belton to seek out any friends and family who might have survived. The reality of this world far exceeds our imaginations. Pasha, who had long dark blonde hair and deep blue eyes, sighed. She was only in her 20s, and she was quite good-looking. However, her face was a little thin, accentuating the protrusion of her cheekbones. This made her look much older than her actual age. "In the future, we will lead different lives." Roy, who had the typical Loanese characteristics, raised his cup. "To a brand new future." Before he could finish speaking, someone in the bar suddenly screamed. The experienced Roy and company quickly raised their vigilance and cast their gazes over. They saw a young man dressed in ordinary clothes, lying on the ground, rolling back and forth as if he was in extreme pain. Under the dim yellow gas wall lamps, everyone realized that the clothes on the young man's back had been torn open, revealing blood-red streaks. It was as if he had been whipped by a whip. However, no one around him held a whip. The victim had only let out one scream. This was only possible if he had been whipped countless times in an instant. But if that were the case, how could no one notice it? "He's holding a wallet. Could this have something to do with the anomaly just now?" The thin Phil took several looks and said after some deliberation, "Shall I take a look?" Roy thought for a moment and nodded. "Be careful." Phil grunted and walked over from the small round table. With the help of the crowd, he approached the young man who was now whimpering instead of rolling about. He quietly extended his left hand. His target was the seemingly ordinary leather wallet. "Ah!" Phil suddenly screamed as he watched his left wrist snap and land on the ground. Blood splattered from the stump onto the faces and bodies of the people around them. The scene instantly froze. The drunken guests were first stunned before swallowing their saliva. Then, they turned around and ran frantically towards the door or to the corners. "Something's wrong. No one attacked me." Phil nearly fainted from the pain, but he still forced himself to tell Roy, Biles, and Pasha what he had just experienced. Roy's eyes narrowed as he decisively said, "Let's get out of here first." He then turned his head and said to Biles, "Pick up Phil's hand and preserve it well. I remember that a military doctor I met before is also from Belton. After he got discharged from the army, he came here and opened a private clinic. He can effectively treat this kind of wound." The military doctor named Weber was also a Beyonder. When he participated in the war in the South, he had advanced step by step, obtaining medical skills that surpassed reality. It was said that he could sew up a severed limb and restore it to its former flexible state. "All right." Biles agreed without hesitation. He took a few steps forward, took out a wooden box, picked up Phil's severed hand, and put it in. At the same time, Pasha used the mystical ointment she had bought previously to stop Phil's bleeding, and bandaged it. Soon after, the group of four left the bar. After many inquiries, they finally found Weber's clinic with the help of passers-by. The clinic hadn't closed for the day, and the light from the gas lamps inside spread outwards, casting a dim yellow light. Roy politely pulled at the doorbell again and again as he heard the ringing echo inside. However, after a few minutes, no one came to open the door. "He's drunk?" Pasha looked at the miserable Phil and made a guess. Roy shook his head. "I remember that Weber isn't one to drink. Other than being more amorous, he doesn't have any bad habits. Perhaps, he's currently," as he spoke, the middle-sized man with a face full of weathered pockmarks pushed the door open and realized that it was not locked. It was ajar. As the door opened, Roy, Biles, and the others saw two figures. Two figures were hanging in the middle of the clinic. Due to the wind blowing in from the outside, they swayed gently. One was a man in his 30s wearing a white coat, while the other was a young lady in a nurse's uniform. Their lower bodies were naked and their eyes were protruding. Their mouths were half open, and their tongues were squeezed out. They were hung on the ceiling by an invisible rope. Their expressions were filled with fear, despair, and blankness. Weber, Roy recognized the dead man. He, along with Pasha, Phil, and Biles, felt a chill run down their spines. They didn't know why something like this had happened, nor did they know what kind of horrors such an unknown might bring. Boom! The sound of a chair being knocked over sounded from the side, jolting the dazed Roy and company. They looked in the direction of the voice and saw a lady carrying a baby standing up in a fluster. She whispered in horror and confusion, they were having an affair. What had this got to do with their encounter? Roy took a deep breath. He felt that he shouldn't stay here for long. He quickly instructed, "Let's go." He didn't ask Pasha to comfort the lady, nor did he attempt to obtain the clinic's disinfectant and bandages. Biles and the others swallowed their saliva with great difficulty, turned around, and warily left the clinic. To Phil, the horror of the unknown had completely suppressed the pain in his left hand. What exactly happened? Phil asked as he turned into another street, asking as his facial muscles winced. "How would I know?" Biles blurted out. He had seemed to lose control of his emotions. Roy looked around and exhaled. "Calm down. This should be a terrifying beyonder matter that has exceeded our imaginations." "Right. All of this is too strange. That can be the only reason." Pasha nodded in agreement. "Then what should we do?" Phil asked anxiously. Roy thought for a moment and said, "Let's try to leave Belton. Also, analyze what happened before and summarize the patterns hidden within. We can't be sure of the anomalies we might encounter later. We can only ensure our own safety after knowing the underlying rules." "Right." Biles calmed down and agreed with Roy. They discussed as they walked, gradually having some ideas. Weber was hung for adultery. Before Phil's hand was cut off, he tried to take the wallet. "That's a form of theft," Pasha summarized the common point the two incidents had in common. Roy suddenly had an idea. Could it be that they suffered such a situation because they did something illegal? How is that possible? Biles and Phil both replied. As soon as he said that, they suddenly had a corresponding guess, and their expressions turned solemn. "Maybe there's an invisible law enforcer. That's the essence of this beyonder incident," Biles said in thought. Roy tersely acknowledged and said, "That's highly possible. Next, we'll take note of our actions." Pasha and the others nodded and walked on the streets cautiously. Not long after, they arrived at the municipal square and saw that there were many people standing around the notice board. Notice? Roy and the others exchanged looks, wondering if it was a warning that the officials had given to the supernatural incidents. Hence, they approached and used the light from the street lamps to look at the notice on the wooden board. There was a piece of white paper stuck in the middle, and beneath it was a piece of yellow paper. It seemed to be an annex. As they quickly scanned through the notice, Roy, Pasha, and the others quickly had their eyes filled with horror. They seemed to understand the source of the matter. After reading the paper, their eyes landed on the yellow paper. All citizens are to arrest foreigners using all possible means. Arrest foreigners. Roy and the others felt their hearts tighten as they instinctively looked at the citizens around the notice board. As if sensing their gazes, the citizens turned around and cast their gaze at them. Under the dim yellow light from the gas lamps, their eyes seemed to glimmer with a strange light. Chapter 1282 Crime. How can someone tell at a glance if another person is a foreigner? How do you distinguish that? Roy forcefully composed himself and pretended to be discussing the yellow paper's contents with his companions. He used the hidden meaning in his words to console Phil and Pasha so that they didn't need to panic. After all, other than Biles, who was a native, the remaining three were also citizens of Lone. They didn't have any southern continent blood in them. Nothing about their facial features stood out. But this is a supernatural incident, Pasha stammered. This couldn't be judged by common sense. Roy's heart froze as he looked at the citizens who were slowly approaching in a deadpan manner. He quickly shouted in a low voice, "Run!" As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and ran towards the nearest street entrance. Pasha and Phil followed closely behind. As a local, Biles tacitly held the rear, covering the surface of his skin with illusory fish scales. Bang! 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 A few citizens raised their dual-barreled hunting guns and fired. Roy, Phil, and Pasha were beyonders who were relatively good at fighting. While running, they would occasionally change directions or roll forward, successfully dodging the attacks. Following that, under Pasha's guidance, they passed through the streets and escaped their pursuers before hiding in an empty dark corner. What should we do? Phil, who had lost a hand, panted as he asked, from the contents of the notice, we probably won't be able to leave this city. We need to figure out the rules and find a way around them. Although Roy was also very flustered, he still forced himself to calm down and think, lest the morale of the entire squad crumbled. Pasha looked at the wary Biles and asked, has such a notice ever appeared in the past? Biles nodded. Yes, although I rarely had the chance to go to the municipal square, I've been assembled there back when I was recruited into the army. I've seen that notice board. There shouldn't be any problems with the notice board. Perhaps those two pieces of paper are the key. The laws written on them contain mystic intent, Pasha said. Roy immediately expressed his agreement. That's right. Besides, I suspect that the laws have to be made public before they are put into effect. If we can find an opportunity to rip off those two pieces of paper, the corresponding restrictions might disappear. After hearing Roy's words, Pasha, Phil, and Biles fell silent. After a few seconds, Phil's facial muscles twitched as he said, let's give it a try. If we continue to be trapped in the city, even if we aren't caught by those citizens, we might be punished for various reasons. Although they were all beyonders, their sequences weren't high. It wasn't a problem dealing with a few ordinary people, but facing the enmity of an entire city was extremely dangerous. Roy, Biles, and Pasha were more or less people who had been on the battlefield before. They knew that hesitation was the worst action to take in such situations, so they agreed to Phil's suggestion. Under the guidance of the rather experienced hunter, Pasha, the group of four made a detour and returned to the municipal square from another street. At this moment, the residents who were surrounding the notice were no longer there. It was as if they were searching the entire city for foreigners. When they saw the notice board that stood silently in the middle of two gas lamps, Roy and company carefully approached it, ready to escape at any moment. After approaching the target, Roy suddenly thought of a question. He hurriedly lowered his voice and asked, is destroying the notice considered an illegal act? In theory, yes, Pasha was taken aback. They then cast their gaze at the notice board and scanned through the list of crimes stipulated by the third law. 8. Destroying public property. It really exists. Biles blurted out. Phil, whose face had turned pale due to the blood loss, turned paler. After some thought, he said, "What kind of punishment does destroying public property entail?" This wasn't a very serious crime, and the corresponding punishment should be relatively lenient. If that was the case, Phil decided to take the risk to tear the notice and end this horrifying, bizarre event. First-timers get whipped. Just as Roy, Pasha, and Biles were pondering over the answer, a voice sounded from behind them. The four turned around in shock and saw a young man in a black robe and a tall hat. He looked ordinary. The man continued, "A repeated offense is to have one's hand lopped off. I'm not sure what happens after that." "How do you know that?" Fully alert, Roy frowned as he gripped his concealed dagger. The young man smiled and said, "I've tried. It's useless. The notice gets restored very quickly." "So, you've been whipped?" Pasha asked in enlightenment. "Yes." The young man nodded with a relaxed expression. "However, because I also committed fraud, I was later punished with having my hand lopped off." "Fraud?" Biles asked, puzzled. The young man chuckled and replied, "To put it simply, I didn't personally destroy the notice. Instead, I created a dummy to do it. The one who was whipped was also the dummy." As he spoke, he raised his right arm. Like Phil, his wrist was cut neatly. His stump was ghastly white and red, as though he was still bleeding. Suddenly, the stump's flesh squirmed and twisted, as transparent worms crawled out. They intertwined with each other and formed a new hand. During this process, Roy and the others didn't feel the slightest bit of fear. This was because the moment they saw those worms which had details they couldn't discern, their thoughts were thrown in a mess. Random thoughts ran through their minds as they found it difficult to control their emotions. After the palm was covered with skin and became normal, the Beyonders recovered. They retreated a few steps in shock, surprise, and fear. The scene just now had exceeded their understanding. "By the way, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm a wandering magician." The person who had committed a fraud and a case of destruction of public property was none other than Klein. He swept a glance at the four Beyonders and said with a smile, "My best magic trick is to grant someone's wishes. Do you have a wish you would like granted?" Upon hearing this question, Roy's spirits rose as he asked with hope, "Can you take us away from Belton?" "Of course, I'll do my best to do this, but not now." Klein gave his promise. Then, he looked at the handless Phil. "He just said his wish. What's yours?" "Let my hand recover," Phil probed. "All right." Klein cast his gaze at Biles. "Take out his hand." After hesitating for a moment, Biles took out the wooden box as per the mysterious man's instructions and returned the hand inside to Phil. "Come here," Klein said with a smile. Phil mustered his courage and walked over with his severed hand. "Remove the bandages," Klein continued to instruct. "Place the severed arm in its original spot. Let me remind you, don't have it reversed. Otherwise, you'll have to chop it off again and repeat the process." Seeing how confident the other party was, Phil felt a little more confident. He quickly pulled off the bandage that had been stuck to his wound with a twisted expression as he hissed. After placing his severed hand at the stump, Klein took out a piece of white paper and approached. Then, he reached out to wipe the wound. Silently, the piece of paper split into two while Phil felt the pain disappear. He quickly looked down and saw that his left wrist was perfectly intact. He couldn't even tell that he had been hurt before. Phil subconsciously moved his fingers and realized that he didn't lose any of his motor skills at all. "Your wish has been granted." Klein took 2 steps back and smiled. "Thank you," Phil replied in a daze. Klein looked at the other 2 Beyonders. "What's your wish?" Upon seeing that Phil's wish had really been fulfilled, Biles immediately stepped forward and said, I want to know where my family is. Klein flicked his left arm and took out a silver mirror with ancient patterns. He lowered his head and said with a smile, "What is the answer to that question?" The surface of the mirror shimmered with aqueous light as silver words appeared one after another. Belton Glorin Cemetery. Upon seeing this, Biles, who had his neck craned, felt his heart sink as he couldn't help but feel a strong sense of sorrow and disappointment. In the next second, new silver words appeared from the aqueous light. S. Gravekeeper's Hut. This means that. Biles felt his sorrow turn to happiness as he sincerely said, "Thank you." As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly thought of two questions. How many people could live in the graveyard? How many gravekeepers could there be? His family members definitely numbered more than 2 or 3. Biles's expression turned oscillated between gloom and joy before he fell silent. As a result, he didn't see the question posed by the silver mirror. "Great Master, did I answer kindly enough?" "Yes." Klein nodded indiscernibly as he cast his gaze at the remaining lady. Pasha thought for 2 seconds and said, "My wish is for you to protect us until we leave Belton alive." She realized that Roy's wish was problematic because they might not necessarily leave Belton alive. "Smart." Klein praised with a smile. "Your wish will be granted." "Then what price do we have to pay?" "I'm referring to the payment for watching your magic." Pasha hurriedly asked. "Your wishes are the price," Klein replied briefly before asking thoughtfully, "If you know certain things are fake, but if you are willing to subjectively use them, it shouldn't be considered fraud, right?" When Roy and company heard this, they were puzzled. After pondering for a moment, they shook their heads and said, "Definitely not. This is actually a game between 2 parties. A voluntary action that has a clear understanding of the actions is definitely not a scam. There's no doubt about it." After hearing their answers, Klein smiled. "Very good. This is what the average person will think." As he spoke, he grabbed a few times with his right hand, dragging out a woman in a simple robe with black long hair. It was the historical void projection of the Evernight Cloister's matron, Ariana. Klein looked around and saw nothing unusual. He smiled at the projection and said, "Madam, what exactly happened?" Ariana's eyes darted about slightly, turning deep and quiet instantly. It made one feel a sense of serenity from the bottom of their hearts. She calmly spoke, "The chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat, Larian, escaped. I'm tracking him." Ariana paused and said, "After I came to Belton, I received new information. According to our intelligence, Larian took away a sealed artifact when he escaped." 0-02 Chapter 1283 Gradually deepening 0-02 Klein inwardly repeated the serial number, feeling that the problem might be more troublesome than he had expected. Although it couldn't be said that 0-02 was definitely more terrifying than 0-05 since the true essence of the magic wishing lamp was that of a sealed outer deity, an entity far stronger than the present true deities, he could definitely destroy this world or even this solar system if not for the restrictions of the outer shell. However, the smaller the number meant that 0-02 was likely more dangerous and more difficult to seal than 0-05 in most cases. At the end of the 4th epoch, the 7 churches had serialized the batch of Grade 0 sealed artifacts to 2-digit numbers. Being only second to 0-01, it's totally possible to imagine how terrifying 0-02 is. However, the God of Combat didn't seem to make use of this sealed artifact in the Battle of Gods. Was it not suitable for direct combat, or was it too dangerous? It didn't distinguish between friend and foe? Thoughts ran through Klein's mind. His expression gradually turned serious. "Ma'am, what do you know about 0-02? Ariana slowly shook her head and said, "When the various churches inform each other of the Grade 0 and Grade 1 sealed artifacts, they only mention the serial numbers." "That's right. The information regarding a Grade 0 sealed artifact is strictly confidential internally to a church. As part of the brass, they usually have to be in charge of a particular Grade 0 sealed artifact before they can come into contact with any related information. Furthermore, there's a high chance that the corresponding memories will be erased after everything is over. This is, on the one hand, to prevent important information from leaking, and on the other hand, there's the fact that just knowing about Grade 0 sealed artifacts in most cases can result in danger, or cause the seal to be ineffective. Klein asked in thought, didn't the church already take over the Church of the God of Combat? That way, they could have obtained all the files on 0-02. Ariana looked at the nearby Roy and company and said, Larian destroyed all files regarding the Grade 0 sealed artifacts before escaping. Impressive. Such an abnormally cautious fellow is really annoying. Klein thought and said, what comments does the goddess have of 0-02? From his point of view, the Evernight goddess and the god of combat were existences from the same period. Furthermore, she was in control of the concealment authority. The goddess had a high chance of understanding the situation that the latter grasped. In addition, it was impossible for the sealed artifacts at the level of 0-02 not to leave any traces in history. They might have created many disasters, so they were no stranger to high-level figures of that era. Ariana seemed to have recalled the situation from a long time ago. She stated without any pause, in the past revelation, the goddess called 0-02 the Book of Rules. Book of Rules. That's even more terrifying. Klein's eyes narrowed as he made plenty of connections. In his past life, he was a gaming enthusiast who played a broad genre of games despite not being too obsessed. He wasn't unfamiliar with the term Book of Rules at all. At this moment, Ariana added, the fact that you happen to be in Belton City might reveal some of the characteristics of 0-02. Yes, it's quite normal for Ma'am Ariana to encounter such an anomaly while tracking the chief shepherd, Larian, to Belton, but for me to also be here, it's too much of a coincidence. In mysticism, excessive coincidences often mean that there's something wrong. Is someone setting me up, or is it the effect of the law of beyonder characteristic convergence? Based on the present situation, the setup doesn't seem targeted, and how I'm already the owner of Sapphira Castle, I can more or less sense something abnormal. If it's the law of beyonder characteristic convergence, eliminating the exiled Mr. Dor and the Antigonus ancestor who is sealed in the foggy town, the only ones that can influence me to this extent are Zeradal and Amon. However, I've always been deliberately avoiding Zeradal. Amon's true body should be under the true creator's pursuit. If it's just an avatar, it's impossible for it to produce such a powerful convergence effect. Yes, there's another possibility. The law of convergence between Sphirot. 0-02 attracted Sapphira Castle, causing me to coincidentally come to Belton today? If that's the case, even if 0-02 isn't a Sapphira, it's definitely related to one. Klein, who had already suspected something, suddenly thought of a lot. He had a vague grasp of 0-02. He thought for a moment and said, from the development of the situation, the rules are gradually becoming stricter. That piece of yellow paper is evidence. Does this mean that the extent of 0-02's coming to life or the degree of reawakening is becoming deeper? Ariana nodded serenely and said, that's right. We have to find it before something happens, and also try to seal it. That's why it's best we split up and expand the search radius, saving as much time as possible. Klein had no objections to this. After some thought, he said, Ma'am, you've told me so much. Isn't this considered leaking secrets? No. Ariana gave a rather clear answer. Leaking secrets refers to informing the outside world of the anomaly in Belton via any way. This has cut off any physical connection between us and the outside world. That's fine. At least, there's no need to worry about any problems with our usual conversations. In short, it's fine if we don't curse. Klein silently heaved a sigh of relief and asked, "The Nighthawks and mandated punishers here will abide by the rules on the notice?" "Yes." Ariana gave an affirmative answer before her figure faded away and disappeared. After watching the matron of the Evernight cloister leave, Klein quickly sorted out the information he had just obtained and gained some understanding of the possible developments that were to come. Combat wasn't the main point. The crux of the problem was whether he could find 0-02 in time and think of a way to seal it. During this process, what they would face as foreigners would become more and more complicated. They would find it increasingly difficult to abide by the rules and the citizens that were controlled. With this in mind, Klein cast his gaze to Roy and company not far away. He asked with a smile, "What are your thoughts on what you just heard?" Roy exchanged looks with Pasha and said, "We don't know what a Grade 0 sealed artifact is, but we can guess that 0-02 is a very terrifying item. It can set the rules and even change reality to a certain extent. Furthermore, this anomaly seems to change as time passes. Also, the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat should be a very powerful Beyonder." Klein gently clapped his hands and smiled. "That's about it. If we don't work hard and hope to avoid danger by hiding, then there will be more and more things that we need to take note of. If we aren't careful, we might commit a crime. Perhaps in the end, we will be executed on the spot because we stepped out the door with our left foot first." His words left Pasha, Biles, and the others in a panic. It was indeed funny to hear the possible developments, but on second thought, they could sense the extreme horror hidden within. A few seconds later, Pasha said with a solemn expression, "Furthermore, the citizens can use any means to deal with us, but we are unable to fight back. This is because killing and voluntarily causing harm are very serious crimes. We can try to deceive their senses, but we can't use it too many times," Klein said casually. "What we need to do now is to quickly summarize the rules that 0-02 follows. That way, we can find it and seal it before it comes to life or awakens to gain true intelligence. What are your thoughts?" Marauder Phil thought for a moment and probed, "It doesn't seem capable of attacking us directly. It can only punish us when we violate the rules and commit crimes." Klein snapped his fingers and said, "That's right. I can summarize this law for now. 0-02 cannot punish those who do not commit crimes." Biles blurted out, "But it can make the citizens arrest foreigners. Foreigners aren't considered criminals." "This does contradict the previous law from before," Klein replied with a smile. "However, in history, many cities have come up with laws that include discrimination and the expulsion of foreigners in the different stages of their development. Did you decipher any deeper laws from this matter?" The four Beyonders frowned one after another, unsure what the powerful magician opposite them was trying to express. After a brief silence, Pasha, who thought of the question he had asked, asking whether a particular action was considered fraud, hesitated and said, "The rules issued by 0-02 must match the public's understanding and be acknowledged to a certain extent." "That's a good idea," Klein praised. "This is a guess thanks to the law regarding the arrest of foreigners. It has been verified from your previous feedback, so we can temporarily list it as its second law. This can help us determine which actions are crimes and which aren't." Seeing Pasha receive the praise of the powerful magician twice, Roy hurriedly added, "It will constantly increase the number of laws, reaching a certain level of complexity, thereby limiting us. No matter what we do, we will be punished. Yes, on the basis of arresting foreigners, clauses such as the trespassing of private property and the prohibition of defecation or urination in public will make life harder for us with the passage of time." Just as Klein nodded in agreement, his spiritual perception was triggered. He instinctively raised his head and looked at the notice board. He realized that a goatskin parchment had appeared on it at some point in time. "Curfew order, this." Pasha and the others also noticed this change and their eyes widened. It was already late at night. If they stayed outside for some time, they would violate the curfew and suffer some punishment. Then, the punishment would worsen each time until they were sentenced to death. Let's go. We haven't got much time. Klein pressed down his tall hat and said with a smile, our target is most likely a book. It might still be with the chief shepherd, or it might have already been hidden somewhere. My intuition tells me that it might be the latter. This is because, to anyone, that item is too dangerous, and it will only become more dangerous. Of course, the premise is that the chief shepherd hasn't gone crazy, only using 0-02 to create a chance to escape pursuit. By the way, I forgot to tell you that the chief shepherd is a grounded angel. Angel. Roy, Pasha, and the others, who had just begun to move, froze. Chapter 1284 Limitation Loophole. In the present era of this world, belief in a deity was common. The difference was which deity they believed in. Therefore, even if Roy, Pasha, and company didn't understand the meaning of angels in mysticism, they had more or less heard of legends about angels from the priests, bishops, and seniors around them. They knew that they were the servants of deities, and were powerful creatures that were qualified to be addressed as him or her. Every action of theirs could create miracles. They were definitely not something ordinary people could compare with. In the hearts of these four beyonders, angels were of a whole different level, holy spirits of another world. Under normal circumstances, they lived in the divine kingdoms and wouldn't descend into the real world. They could be treated as true legends without considering the meaning they had in reality. Just like the battles they had experienced in the past, although they would occasionally encounter beyonders today who struck terror in their hearts, like today, them being angels was the last thing on their mind. The two weren't on the same level. But today, a wandering and mysterious magician had informed them that the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat was an angel who walked the land. Phil and the others believed in the mysterious gentleman, who had shown all kinds of amazing feats, from the bottom of their hearts. Firstly, he had granted their wishes and was friendly enough. Secondly, they didn't believe that they were qualified enough to be deceived in such matters. To them, the chief shepherd was an angel or an abnormally powerful beyonder. In essence, there was no difference between the two. The reality of this world far exceeds our imaginations. The words that Pasha often said flashed through her mind. Roy made further connections. He remembered that the lady, whom Mr. Magician had invited from thin air, mentioned that she was pursuing the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat. Furthermore, she seemed to be qualified to see the Evernight goddess's revelation. The only person who can track an angel is probably another angel. With Mr. Magician's performance in front of that lady, his level can't be that much lower. Roy hurriedly retracted his gaze from Klein's back and didn't dare to look at him directly. He looked left and right and realized that Phil had come to a similar guess as well. A complicated feeling emerged from his pale face, one that was a result of his blood loss. Biles held his breath and only spoke after a few seconds. No wonder there's such an inexplicable change in Belton. It's not the time to feel poignant about this. Let's hurry up and leave. The curfew is about to take effect, Klein reminded with a smile without any signs of nervousness. Pasha quickly looked at the notice board and imprinted the contents into a brand in her mind. From 8 at night to 8 in the morning. Free movement and assembling in the streets are forbidden. Where should we go? She blurted out. Under the double restrictions of the curfew and the no trespassing clause, it appeared as though they could only await punishment. Klein smiled and said, only movement and assembly in the streets are forbidden. As he spoke, he pointed at a nearby manhole which led to the sewers. Biles's eyes lit up. Yes, it didn't say that we can't pass through the sewers. When curfews were in place previously, the tramps hid in the sewers or abandoned buildings. Roy and the others didn't hesitate any longer. They immediately went forward and used the advantage of their strength to push open the manhole cover and climbed into the sewers. In the pitch-black darkness, a dim yellow light lit up as a lantern appeared in Klein's hand. As they followed the mystical magician, Phil said thoughtfully, "We can head to a hotel next. Biles is a local. He won't be attacked, so he can get a room. Then, we can climb through the window and enter from the outside. As we have gotten permission from the owner, we wouldn't be considered as trespassing on private property. In that case, we can stay until dawn and wait for the curfew to end." "It's a very interesting idea, but our goal isn't to survive until dawn," Klein replied with a smile as he walked ahead of them with the lantern in hand. Roy nodded and said, "If we don't do anything and stay in the hotel, the rules will increase one by one, becoming so detailed that guests aren't allowed to stay in hotel rooms." Actually, the most interesting thing about that proposal isn't the finding of loopholes to the restrictions, but that it reminded me of something. Klein turned his body slightly and looked at Biles. "As a local from Belton, he actually didn't attempt to capture us foreigners. In other words, he wasn't affected by the Yellow Paper's orders." This. Pasha and the others all turned warily to look at Biles, clearly showing suspicion on their faces. Their encounter earlier had made them certain that the citizens of Belton City had lost their minds in the foreigner arresting affair. "I don't know why either," Biles also murmured in confusion. "Are you still a Belton citizen?" Klein asked casually as he slowly walked in the damp and smelly sewer. Biles followed behind him and answered with some certainty, "Of course." Klein thought and asked, "On the one hand, you are a citizen of Belton. On the other hand, you are a standard foreigner. Two of your attributes overlap, causing a contradiction. Under that order, you will neither be attacked, nor will you have your rationality affected. If we can create such a contradiction, does it mean we will be able to escape the limitations of the rules?" Phil asked spiritedly. Pasha shook her head. "But such a contradiction is very hard to create. At least I can't think of any possibility right now." She suddenly paused and hesitated before saying, "The most important thing is that we're far away from the notice board. We don't know what other laws will follow. We have no way of avoiding them. When that happened, they wouldn't dare to do anything." Klein smiled and said, "Don't worry. This mirror can help us see the new content on the notice board." He casually displayed the magic mirror that had slipped into his left palm. Pasha heaved a sigh of relief and asked curiously, "Isn't this a crime of peeping?" On the surface of the silver mirror, words that resembled dripping blood appeared. "The way I look at the notice board is like looking at the sun in the day. There's no need to peep." Klein retracted his magic mirror and added with a smile, "Besides, this is just an item. How can it commit a crime?" "That really makes sense." Biles and Phil couldn't help but nod. After Roy figured it out, he exhaled and asked, "Next, the most important thing is to find that item, but we don't have any clues. As a book, it can be anywhere. We can only carpet search the entire city, but we clearly lack the time to do that. Indeed, we don't know where 0-02 is. We don't even have any clues, but there's an existence that knows the answer very clearly," Klein replied leisurely as he heard the footsteps echoing in the sewers. Pasha's heart stirred. "You mean that chief shepherd?" Klein smiled and nodded. 0-02 is either in his hands, or it has been hidden by him somewhere. And a book is clearly unable to move on its own. This isn't something that the current rules can help it achieve. "But how do we find that chief shepherd?" Biles blurted out. Perhaps it was because the magical Mr. Magician was by his side, he wasn't that afraid of searching for the grounded angel. Klein calmly held the lantern and said, "As long as 0-02 doesn't provide the chief shepherd immunity, he, too, would have to abide by the laws on the notice. He was originally from Faysac, so he is undoubtedly not a citizen of Belton. He is unable to enjoy the treatment of the locals. Similarly, although he is an angel from elsewhere and not a foreigner in the narrow sense of the word, he isn't human, he too will be pursued by the citizens. This can be confirmed." In short, that chief shepherd has to abide by the curfew and not trespass private residences. He can't hide in a public area that isn't open to the public at night. At the same time, as a fugitive, he likely doesn't have companions who have dual traits like Biles. Tell me, where do you think he will be? Roy's eyes darted around as he gave several answers: sewers, cemetery, cathedral before midnight, abandoned buildings. You can't enter the cemetery at night. The abandoned buildings are owned by someone or some group by virtue of its property rights, Pasha reminded. Yes. Once the sewers are restricted, we will head to the cathedral to search for the chief shepherd or wait for him, Klein said in a relaxed tone as though he was deciding on a trivial matter. Roy, Phil, and the others were stunned. They hadn't expected that they would be able to lock onto their target so easily. It just took a few words of discussion to expose an angel's whereabouts. However, there are quite a few cathedrals in Belton. We have to act in concert to save time. Also, the cathedral might be able to forcefully resist the punishment by relying on his level as an angel and his powers. With that said, Klein lowered his head and said to the magic mirror in his hand, "Arads, monitor the entire city and pay attention to any anomalies." After giving his instructions to the mirror, Klein once again dragged Ma'am Ariana out of the fog of history and asked her to be in charge of the cathedrals of the Church of Evernight. After doing so, he turned around and said to Roy, Pasha, and company, "If we still can't find the chief shepherd after all that is done, it means that he has either left Belton, leaving 0-02 behind to attack the enemy, or he has already gained control of 0-02 to a certain extent. In short, we can proceed by means of elimination for now." Roy and company nodded in unison as they continued following Klein in the sewers. After a few minutes, the ancient silver mirror reflected a scene. On the signboard, there was another piece of paper with new rules. Because of municipal maintenance works, no living being is allowed to enter the sewers from now on. Content is being added at an increasing rate. Klein frowned indiscernibly as he muttered to himself before taking out a human-skinned glove. Immediately after, he gestured for Pasha and the others to hold hands. Then, he grabbed one of them by the shoulder and led them out of the sewers to teleport to the nearest storm cathedral. During this process, the four Beyonders first saw the rats and cockroaches in the sewers twitching as they died one after another. Following that, they were attracted by the strange and abstract spirit world, as though they had suffered some sort of catharsis at the mental level. Chapter 1285. Forget about leaving, all of you. Although there weren't many supplicants in the Storm Cathedral in the evening, Klein chose to appear on a corridor that led to the garden so as to avoid conflict. How magical, Pasha muttered to herself as she looked at the settling surroundings. Roy suppressed his emotions and looked around. If that chief shepherd comes to the cathedral to tide over the curfew, he could be somewhere like this. If one isn't worried about accumulating the number of crimes they commit, an angel has too many ways to fool the average person, Klein said casually. I'll send you to the other cathedrals later. Try to stay in places with glass windows and mirrors. Once you discover any outsiders that might be from Fasak, find an opportunity to draw a symbol. Before he could finish his sentence, his head suddenly turned as he looked at the door leading to the garden in the prayer hall. A figure over 2.6 meters tall slowly walked out. He was wearing a long black robe with white edges, one completely filled with his bulging muscles. This was an old, white-bearded man wearing a square hat. His eyes were pale blue, and he had few wrinkles. He had an aura of superciliousness. The chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat, Larian. Without needing to identify the figure, Klein's spiritual intuition told him that the person opposite him was an angel, the reason for coming to the cathedral. Larian glanced at him and said in surprise, "It's not Ariana." He immediately restrained his expression and said rather indifferently, "Appears to be her helper. You can tell her that I've reached an agreement with 0-02, which has come alive to a certain degree. I'll give up sealing it in exchange for permission to leave. And y'all will stay here, enduring the changes in the rules and the increasingly stricter laws until y'all are completely dead. The chief shepherd didn't seem to be worried that Klein would stop him at all. This was because when he spoke, his body was rapidly aging. The surface of his skin quickly became covered in wrinkles, with aging spots appearing on it, dripping with a rotting liquid. In just a few blinks of an eye, Larian looked as though he was about to evaporate into thin air from his aging. Then, he turned into a pool of rotten liquid that completely evaporated. The impact of this scene sent shivers down Biles and Company's spines. They felt as if their minds were about to go haywire and that their emotions were about to collapse. This was just like the countless tiny worms that had crawled out from the wound on Mr. Magician's wrist when he reformed his hand. It was just as terrifying and harrowing. A strange ability. It has something to do with Twilight? Klein didn't have any intention of stopping Larian. He only nodded in thought. In the spirit world corresponding to Belton, Larian's figure appeared and returned to normal. Right on the heels of that, as though he could control spirit world creatures, he passed through an invisible barrier and escaped the many restrictions of Belton City. But just as Larian was about to begin tearing through space, everything suddenly darkened and he saw a seamless patch of dark cloth. It was like a wall that blocked Larian's path. Larian cautiously stopped his actions, looked up at the infinitely high area where the 7 pure lights were. However, he could only see an illusory curtain hanging down from it, enveloping the spirit world of the area corresponding to Belton, isolating it and creating an independent world. At the same time, Larian's intuition as a demon hunter had told him that the barrier formed by the curtain was extremely strong and difficult to break through. He needed to spend a lot of time and effort to do so. To this chief shepherd, what was happening had a strange comical feeling, making him unable to contain his rising anger. This was akin to him finally finding the key to a secret chamber after countless hardships. Just when he had the chance to open the door and leave before others could, he was surprised to find that there was an additional lock on the chamber's door, a rather sturdy lock. It lacks a sense of realism. It's a projection from the historical void. It's fraud. No, it's outside of Belton City, out of the law's jurisdiction. This historical projection should have existed here a long time ago. It can't last more than 2 minutes, so it will dissipate on its own. Larian quickly regained his composure, allowing his anchors and inclination towards madness to once again form a balance. In the corridor of the Storm Cathedral, Roy and Company finally recovered. They turned their heads to look at Mr. Magician, who was in no way inferior to the angel from before. Pasha hesitated for a moment before saying fearfully, He seems to have escaped. This way, they wouldn't be able to obtain any information about 0-02's location. Relying on a carpet search would be too late. Furthermore, no one present knew what the terrifying sealed artifact looked like. Describing it as a book made it too wide a scope. I can only think of other solutions, Klein replied with a smile. Do you have any suggestions? He had been waiting for Larian to return and negotiate with him, but he realized that the chief shepherd would rather wait in the spirit world for the curtain historical projection to disappear. And although he could enter the spirit world as well, he was unable to break through the strange barrier created after 0-02's law changing. As he spoke, Klein seriously considered other solutions and made a few worms of spirit control his body. He spoke to the Beyonders beside him in an attempt to find inspiration through their discussion. We should take the initiative to create a contradiction that's similar to what happened to Biles so that we'll be in a relatively safe state. Only by doing so will we be able to begin our search. Phil brought up the idea that he had previously had. Pasha shook her head. But if we use this kind of a contradiction to do something, 0-02 will definitely add new rules to resolve the corresponding problems. But this can still buy us some time, Phil emphasized. That is something that can be done, Roy agreed, and added, but our focus should be on finding 0-02. Perhaps we can create some contradiction that will make it expose its location? As for what kind of contradiction could achieve such an effect or how to create it, he hadn't come up with an idea. In the event of a contradiction, new rules will be added to resolve it. Klein wore a smile as he listened silently. Sparks flew as his thoughts crashed in his mind. At that moment, aqueous light appeared on the surface of the magic mirror in his hand as silver words appeared. Pasha, do you want to know what the new content on the notice board is? The mirror directly asked me. Why did it ask me directly? Pasha was taken aback for a moment before she hurriedly nodded and answered, yes. The aqueous light in the silver mirror quickly returned and presented a scene of the notice board. There were 2 new rules. In compliance with the curfew order, the various cathedrals will shut down early. All hotels shall only accommodate guests who have registered their identities. Phil panicked. Where do we go now? He had no idea how he, Roy, and Pasha could escape the punishment. Roy and Pasha exchanged looks as various thoughts surged through their minds, but none of them were viable. At this moment, Klein, who had been maintaining his silence, smiled and cast his gaze at Biles. Where's your house in Belton? A rental apartment on 18 Maple Street, but that apartment has already collapsed from the blast of an artillery shell, Biles answered, slightly perplexed. Klein smiled and said, you can make a wish to return your house to its original state. I'll grant it. Can that be done? Although the magical magician had healed Phil's severed hand with unbelievable powers, Biles still felt that it would be much more difficult to restore a collapsed house to its original state. After all, Dr. Weber, the military doctor who Roy mentioned, was capable of doing that. Of course. Klein smiled and reminded him. Make haste. At that moment, the supplicants in the cathedral were leaving one after another. Biles didn't dare to delay any further as he immediately said, I wish that my house will return to its original state. All right. Klein raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. Your wish has come true. While Roy and company were in a daze, Klein activated teleport once again and brought them to 18 Maple Street. He stopped outside a 2-bedroom room. Biles stared blankly at the familiar wooden door in front of him. Subconsciously, he reached out his right hand and pushed it open. The cupboard, gas stove, bunk bed, wooden table covered in oil, and the messy old newspapers strewn everywhere were reflected in his eyes as his eyes immediately moistened. Before the war broke out, he often saw his mother busying herself around the coal stove when he came back from the mines. His father and brother either made use of the time to do some repairs or helped to handle the spoiled parts of the fruit and vegetables. They did some of the work that could be taken home. His young niece learned the alphabet from old newspapers under the guidance of her mother while she put together matchstick boxes. Although such a life was tough and didn't have any ability to avoid risks, it was still a wonderful memory for Biles. It was many times better than the dark mine paths, heavy ores, and the whipping from the supervisors. But now, even this tiny bit of beauty was completely destroyed. Aren't you going to invite us in? Phil stood at the door, not daring to trespass on the private property. After snapping back to his senses, Biles hurriedly said, please come on in. After entering the unoccupied house, Klein pulled a chair that could break at any moment and sat down. He then fell silent. Roy, Pasha, and the others did not dare to disturb the gentleman as they waited quietly by his side. After 20 to 30 seconds, Klein suddenly looked around and said with a smile, I have an idea that requires verification. Who wants to work with me on this? I'll do it, Roy replied without hesitation. Klein smiled and replied, afterward, don't truthfully answer the questions. I'm looking for the loopholes hidden in 0-02's rules. Roy nodded and said, that wouldn't be an issue. Klein immediately took out the magic mirror and said to Roy, ask it a question. Roy thought for a moment and said, where can I find my next potion? A scene appeared on the surface of the silver mirror. It was the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat, Larian, who was pacing around the spirit world. Roy's expression instantly stiffened. Then, he heard Mr. Magician say, "It's your turn to answer its question. Remember, don't give it the correct answer." Roy hurriedly reined in his thoughts and looked back at the mirror. He saw that the mirror had already transformed into Mr. Magician himself, and a few more lines of blood-like text appeared. "Who did you give your first time to?" Roy instantly recalled the past as his face flushed red. Then, he answered according to Mr. Magician's instructions, "I'm not sure." A lie. The blood-colored text on the silver mirror instantly condensed into the terrifying words. "Pa!" A bolt of lightning appeared out of nowhere and struck Roy. Roy convulsed in pain as his body was charred black. His hair stood on end, but his life wasn't truly in danger. Biles, Pasha, and Phil were all startled, unsure what had just happened. At this moment, Klein looked around and smiled. "Look, the mirror didn't get punished for voluntarily causing harm. A real opportunity lies in here." Chapter 1286 New Applications of Old Methods. A real opportunity. Pasha, Biles, and Phil were delighted to hear this. It was as if they had finally seen the light after searching for a long time in the dark night. "What kind of opportunity?" Roy blurted out from his dazed state. Klein wasn't in a rush. He smiled and said, "Did you guys not notice? There is no clear indication on the notice of who the enforcer is." As a keyboard warrior in the past, Klein had always claimed to be a jack of all trades. Furthermore, he had interacted with many lawyers in his life and had an Earl of the Fallen marionette before. He had the basic foundation needed when it came to the law and rules. That's right, the announcement only mentioned a new consul, and it's not clear who the enforcer is. We encountered an invisible justiciar previously. Pasha and the others revealed a thoughtful expression. Upon seeing this, Klein reached out his hand and stroked the surface of the magic mirror as though he was combing an animal. Under normal circumstances, everyone has tacitly acknowledged that the police and the authorities responsible for dealing with supernatural cases enforce the law. This is confirmed through a series of legal documents or the corresponding public knowledge. But this time, the rules haven't reached such an airtight level. If we say that the rules are built on a blank slate composed of the original laws, directives, and rules, then we should have seen the police, the Nighthawks, or the mandated punishers when we committed crimes, but that's not the case. In other words, the corresponding enforcer is indeed vague. Pasha, who was the most knowledgeable among the four Beyonders, thought for a moment before saying, "Perhaps, the law enforcer is an abstract concept. Or perhaps it is tacitly equivalent to the new consul." The latter isn't clear either. It doesn't make it clear who the new consul is. This way, it can be anyone. The former isn't obliged to make it known, Klein simply replied. Phil frowned and said, "But we can't enforce the law like the citizens. The corresponding authority is determined by eliminating groups via labels," Klein explained with a smile. Foreigners are targets of ostracization and pursuit, so they obviously lack the required law enforcement rights. As for the citizens, they only have it when dealing with foreigners. This is confirmed through the notice. Without waiting for Roy and Biles to speak, Klein continued, "So, I just used the contradiction hidden in this matter to get Roy to test it. The result is exactly as I predicted. First of all, the magic mirror isn't a foreign living being, neither is it a local. It's just an item with a certain level of intelligence. It cannot be placed into any particular group. This way, in a situation where the law enforcer isn't clear, those who aren't part of the elimination process have the right to enforce the law. Secondly, it had punished a foreigner. Those notices imply that all who deal with foreigners are law enforcers. Finally, the magic mirror itself has the rules of punishment. Before this rule is announced to be illegal, it has the right to punish others. Based on the 3 points above, I believe that 0-02 should be in a lot of conflict right now. Next, it will definitely issue a new law to clearly determine the main body of law enforcement, to mend the loopholes in this area. Once the main body of the law enforcement is revealed, it will contain a lot of information. It will help us lock onto the target. If 0-02 uses a method of adding prohibitions, it will definitely restrict itself, as it shares the same attributes as the mirror. This is definitely not its first choice. At that moment, Roy, Pasha, and the others, who were listening to Klein's recount, suddenly had the feeling that he was a knowledgeable and highly intelligent person. Could it be that Mr. Magician is a wise man who likes to travel among the commoners and legends? The 4 Beyonders each made similar but different guesses. At this moment, the magic mirror in Klein's hand emitted a misty aqueous light. Amidst the aqueous light, the silver mirror's surface showed the notice board. 2 more lines appeared on the bottom of the original piece of paper: all law enforcement must be carried out by the Trunsoist Brass Book or the group it authorizes. Any private rules can't surpass the official decree. Trunsoist Brass Book. This is the full name of 0-02. The opportunity is here. Klein's expression turned serious as he entered cogitation. He had forced 0-02 to clarify the main law enforcement to obtain more information so as to further understand the situation of the terrifying sealed artifact. And based on Klein's deduction, 0-02 was more or less related to a particular Sapphira, just like how he was back when he had yet to become the owner of Sapphira Castle. Therefore, furthering his understanding of it would inevitably result in reverse corruption, thereby establishing a certain connection. To a certain extent, the Sapphira was equivalent to a great old one, outer deity, or the cosmos. Back then, Klein had used such mysticism knowledge to lock onto the location of dark demonic wolf Kotar. Now, he was using it in the opposite direction. From his point of view, 0-02 was definitely more corrupted by a Sapphira than him. After all, sealed artifacts were in a state of having lost control. This was why they needed to be sealed. Under such circumstances, further understanding of 0-02 would result in corruption. The reality proved Klein's hypothesis. And it was also because of this danger that he didn't show the new content presented by Rhodes to the 4 Beyonders. In cogitation, Klein quickly sensed that he had an invisible connection with a certain spot. The indescribable corruption was surging over. Ding! At the same time he flicked out a gold coin, he used Sapphira Castle's aura to cut off the connection and isolate the corruption. Immediately after, a clear image appeared in his mind. Klein grabbed the gold coin with his left hand. After the glove suddenly turned transparent, he instantly vanished from the room and appeared in a hall filled with bookshelves. On the side of the hall with floor-to-ceiling windows, there were many long rectangular tables. On one of them was a book bound by thin brass sheets. "I've found you." A smile appeared on Klein's face. He made use of the brief connection to do a divination. Then, he relied on the attraction between Sphirot, to make the teleportation become abnormally precise. The law of convergence between Sphirot would allow Klein to accidentally enter the library and discover the brass book. However, it might have happened 2 days later, 2 weeks later, or even 2 years later. It wouldn't happen in time to stop anything. Furthermore, this was under the prerequisite that 0-02 didn't do any corresponding interference or avoidance measures. Pa! The clothes on Klein's back suddenly cracked as blood-red strokes appeared. This was a punishment for trespassing into a public area. Whipping. Thankfully, this crime is very light. And I won't be punished for this crime for the next 1 or 2 minutes. The rules will give the trespasser time to withdraw. Klein immediately reached out and grabbed a few times in the void. He didn't really pull out the figure of the ascetic leader, Ariana. This was because, to a noncommittal person, a historical projection was a form of fraud. He only used this method to send his location information to the servant of concealment. Due to the same reason, Klein dispersed the glove on his left hand. During this process, the brass book started flipping and displayed the rules. When one's rationality drops to 20% of its original value, there would be signs of losing control. Scholar of Yore has the ability to summon historical void projections. The success rate of summoning depends on the familiarity and friendliness of the target. The Trunsoist brass book is the most precious item. No living being is permitted to touch it. Those in violation are to be sentenced to death. One is not allowed to change the condition of the Trunsoist brass book in any way. Those in violation are to be sentenced to death. The rules made Klein's eyelids twitch. He felt his rationality constantly dropping. This caused the primordial one's mental brand in his body to become more active. The first part of the rules is presented in grayish-black, as though it's in a state that can't be changed. This requires 0-02 to awaken further. If it awakens to the extent of changing the rules in front, it'll be very terrifying. It might even reduce the success rate of my summonings, causing Beyonders to show signs of losing control if their rationality falls a little. With this we've fixed the problem of this variant of a seer being too strong. As expected of 0-02. It fully lives up to its serial number. The text behind is presented in silver. Does this mean that the rules can be altered or enhanced? I can't touch it. I can't change its state. That also means that I can't take it away, nor can I directly conceal this sealed artifact. Perhaps I can use the Staff of the Stars or the Box of the Great Old Ones to directly move this library into the cosmos and let 0-02 face those outer deities. But if the outer deities were to grasp this sealed artifact, the problem might be greater than it is now. Klein hesitated for a moment and didn't risk summoning his Grade 0 sealed artifact. The next second, he heard a smacking sound. The figure of Ariana's simple linen robe and tree bark belt was quickly outlined at his side. She was lashed by an invisible whip, leaving behind an obvious bloody mark. The first problem has been resolved. Now, we need to consider the second problem. That is how to seal this fellow, Klein said as he made haste. It wouldn't be long before he would suffer a second punishment. Ariana shook her head. The corresponding information has been destroyed. We can only resolve it through trial and error. That's a little dangerous. We don't know, but someone definitely knows. Klein's heart stirred as he made his spirit body leave his body and enter the spirit world. Through the invisible barrier created by 0-02, he said to the Church of the God of Combat's chief shepherd, Larian, who was waiting for the curtain to disappear, perhaps we can make a deal. You want the method to seal 0-02? Larian turned around and chuckled. Do you think I'll agree? Actually, I'm very puzzled. Why must you sacrifice yourself for the fallen god of combat? By joining the Church of Evernight, you can still be an angel, and you can also receive blessings. You can also live for a very long time. Klein didn't directly respond as he said. Larian's expression darkened as he said, a mythical creature without any pious faith wouldn't be able to understand me. As an evil god, isn't it normal for me to not be devout? Klein couldn't help but mutter inwardly. This was his humanity. Chapter 1287 Guidance. Seeing that Klein was momentarily at a loss for words, the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat, Larian, revealed a solemn expression. Furthermore, the fall of a deity is only temporary. He will eventually return and awaken using my body. Klein frowned slightly when he heard that. He didn't know whether the angel was having mental problems and wasn't far from losing control because of his shaken anchors, or if he was too affected by the god of combat. In a certain sense, he had become his backup. Ignoring the sequence 0 true deities, even kings of angels and a number of angels would often not completely die. You should know very well that the apocalypse will come in another 10 or so years. I believe that the speed of the god of combat's resurrection won't be fast enough. Klein attempted to awaken him with the cruel reality. Larian snorted. You will never be able to imagine the power of God. He didn't give Klein the chance to continue his persuasion and revealed a smile. In short, I won't make a deal with you. Pray to Evernight. Pray to the deity you believe in to seal 0-02 and save you. But all I need to do is wait another 30 to 40 seconds before I can leave this place. Klein looked up at the curtain hanging from infinitely high above and didn't say anything else. He made his spirit body return to the library where the Trunsoist brass book was. Do you have any ideas? He asked without any delay. Ariana shook her head slightly and asked, what did Larian say? He told us to pray to the deities to seal 0-02. As Klein spoke, he was suddenly stunned. What Larian said didn't seem to be problematic, but he had inadvertently revealed a very important piece of information. He believed that deities could seal 0-02, no matter who they were. Then, what does a deity rely on to seal it? By forcefully suppressing it with their sequence 0 status, or use a might that can destroy the world? Many questions appeared in Klein's mind. At this moment, Trunsoist brass book flipped to a blank page, producing silver words one after another. The language it used was the one on the first blasphemy slate. It seemed to be the source of all the languages that were still in use. In the blink of an eye, the silver words formed into new text. The Belton City Library is the place where the Trunsoist brass book is kept. It is a place that must be heavily protected. Living beings who intrude without the Trunsoist brass book's permission will be severely punished. It's an elevation of the punishment. I might be sentenced to death next. Klein's pupils dilated as he quickly deduced the most likely development. However, he didn't panic at all. Instead, he smiled and said with sincerity, my wish is to shrink the size of the Belton City Library, so that the spot where Ma'am Ariana and I are is the boundary line. As soon as he finished speaking, he snapped his fingers and granted his own wish. As the snapping sound reverberated, the lawn that corresponded to the Belton City Library disappeared. The building shrunk and the walls retreated. Soon, only a tenth of its original size was left. Klein and Ariana subconsciously arrived outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Through the open window, they stared at the Trunsoist brass book that remained on the rectangular table. There was no change in the distance between them and the target. They were still very close, but they were no longer within the confines of being severely punished. However, due to their first violation of the curfew, they were once again whipped by an invisible law enforcer. After accumulating the wishes of restoring buildings one after another, Klein could create quite a miracle in this aspect. He didn't make another wish and continued thinking. He analyzed the hidden meaning behind the words of the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat. No, it shouldn't have been forcefully suppressed using a deity status and level. Otherwise, my spiritual intuition would have told me the answer long ago. That would have made me activate Sapphira Castle's aura and complete the seal. From a mysticism point of view, this is understandable. This is because 0-02 is clearly related to a particular Sapphira. It's difficult to suppress it by relying on the status and level of a sequence 0. By relying on the might of the deities themselves? This might be possible, but there's a high chance that it's not the real method. This is because Larian knows of a sealing method that can be completed without relying on the deities. What's special about a sequence 0 deity? And what methods can an angel use to achieve such a special sealing method? The most special thing that I can think of at the moment is that a sequence 0 deity contains a uniqueness. This is something I can't summon from the historical void. It really has the characteristic of being unique. But how can an angel indirectly simulate a uniqueness? Countless thoughts collided in Klein's mind, producing large amounts of sparks, but he still couldn't figure out the key to the problem. At this moment, the mercury-colored words on the Trunsoist brass book continued to seep out, forming new paragraphs that stipulated that Klein and Ariana were a group of people that needed punishment. Ariana observed silently for a while before suddenly saying, "I'll try to conceal the soil beneath the table to make 0-02 fall to the core. Raise your level of alertness to prevent any accidents. Conceal the soil. Fall to the core." Klein's heart stirred. He felt that this was a rather good solution. The Trunsoist brass book had only forbidden the touching and changing its condition at present. The environment wasn't equivalent to its condition. In addition, they were only forbidden from entering Belton City Library. It didn't mean that Klein and Ariana couldn't exert certain influences on it. And when 0-02, which hadn't been banned from leaving, passed through the concealed soil and fell to the core, it would lose its influence on Belton City due to the distance, causing the laws it had set up to fail. That was the case unless it was awakened further or came to life, allowing a larger region to fall under its jurisdiction. This way, Klein and Ariana no longer needed to be restricted by the rules. They could seek help from the Evernight goddess. However, when Ariana finally thought of a solution and was preparing to carry out the plan, a new law was completely formed: the Belton City Library, the place where the Trunsoist brass book is stored. It is a place that must be strictly protected. No living thing or object is to deal any form of damage to it in any way. Indeed, 0-02 has also noticed this loophole. This loophole. As Klein frowned slightly, he suddenly had an idea of what he had been thinking about. The uniqueness of a sequence 0 deity was indeed unique, but their sealing of 0-02 wasn't directly done by using the authority and power that came from it. It was very likely that they could rely on this trait of a uniqueness to lure 0-02 into setting up a series of contradictory rules, causing the sealed artifact to fall into a paradoxical cycle. In this aspect, angels, saints, and even ordinary people could accomplish that by themselves. The key was to think of paradox and guide it into establishing it. As for how to seal 0-02 after it entered a paradoxical cycle and was preparing to fix the loophole, Klein didn't have any clues at the moment, so he needed to make further observations. How should I create a paradox? All the rules and regulations set up by 0-02 quickly flashed through Klein's mind. In just a few seconds, he acutely grasped a point where he could create a paradoxical cycle. He quickly turned his head and said to Ariana, "Ma'am, let's not destroy the city library. We will directly conceal the other parts of the Belton, indirectly causing it to lose the necessary support. This place will then collapse on its own, thus, falling into the core." Ariana didn't immediately do as he said. Instead, she turned her head and gave Klein a deep look. "This will cause the deaths of many civilians. We have to make a choice between the lesser of two evils," Klein said seriously. Ariana didn't respond and fell silent. It was as though she was in an intense mental struggle or making the appropriate preparations. At this moment, the two brass pages that had just written the two articles quickly created more new rules. Belton is the city where the Trunsoist brass book is located, a true holy land in all senses of the phrase. No living thing or object is to deal any form of damage to it in any way. Upon seeing this text, Klein wasn't disappointed. Instead, he smiled. With a snap, he snapped his fingers, causing scarlet flames to surge out of his pocket and quickly drown him. In just 2 to 3 seconds, a stream of flames descended from the sky. Klein jumped out and carried a person. That was one of the 4 Beyonders he had saved previously. He was the Belton local, Biles. "Go in and quickly flip through the brass book," Klein said calmly as he pointed at the 0-02 on the rectangular table. Biles didn't know exactly what had happened, but he believed that this magical magician, who had fulfilled 2 of his wishes, had found a way out of the situation plaguing Belton. Thus, after taking a deep breath, he entered the city library through the miniaturized, open floor-to-ceiling windows. During this process, he didn't receive any severe punishments. In fact, he wasn't even whipped. Upon seeing this scene, Klein's smile widened. 0-02 had produced a paradox. Due to Rhodes's existence, the Trunsoist brass book could only do a most comprehensive prohibition, preventing any living being or object from dealing any form of damage to it in any way. As a city, Belton's definition didn't just include its terrain and buildings. It definitely included the residents here. This way, if 0-02 punished a Belton citizen like Biles, any damage to him would go against the law it had just issued. If it didn't punish him, it would go against the laws that prohibited him from entering the city library. Hence, the Trunsoist brass book had entered a vicious cycle. Of course, Klein believed that such a paradox would quickly be corrected by appending additional clauses. He only hoped that Biles would be able to flip through the brass book and find clues to sealing it. Pay attention to the currently open page. Once an article is about to take shape, immediately come out, Klein instructed as he stared at Biles and 0-02. Chapter 1288 Key Intelligence. Although Biles had witnessed Phil's severed hand, Weber's hanging, and Mr. Magician's palm fused from worms, and also had a certain understanding of the horrifying anomaly brought about by 0-02, his lacking level and experience made him unaware of the true horror behind this matter. He mostly explained it away as a horror tale coming to life. Therefore, despite feeling afraid, he mustered up his courage and quickly approached the rectangular table under the watch of the magical magician and grounded angel. Of course, him being from the sailor pathway was partly responsible. Within 2 or 3 steps, Biles had reached a spot where he could touch the brass book. Without thinking, he reached out his right palm and grabbed the brass pages on 0-02 and quickly flipped them. During this process, the back of Biles's hand held up the brass page, which hadn't completely been filled, to prevent it from being blocked, so as to allow him, Mr. Magician, and Ma'am Angel to observe the changes on it and react in advance. Amidst the flipping sounds, this sailor saw the line that touching the Trunsoist brass book would result in the death sentence. He was first alarmed before he was filled with a strong sense of puzzlement about his current state. However, this didn't affect his action of flipping the pages forward. Klein's eyes reflected the different brass pages, and each page had different rules. The projections of these brass pages didn't appear by making lines disappear and having new ones substitute them. Instead, they appeared side by side and gradually increased in number. In the end, Klein's eyes reflected a different number of brass pages in them. They were neatly arranged, one line after another. It was as though he had split the 0-02 into a single page and placed it on a glass platform to bask in the sun. This was a dream divination technique at the angel level, allowing Klein to reproduce the scenes he had just seen before his very eyes. With the passage of time, the brass pages in his dark brown eyes began to spin and pinpoint one of them. The Trunsoist brass book originates from a justiciar uniqueness that had been corrupted by the nation of disorder. It's exactly as I expected. Since the Trunsoist brass book can produce all the low-level rules, the corresponding content must contain a description of itself. This is determined by its essence. Unless it completely awakens or comes alive, and has the sufficient intelligence to know how to selectively hide it. Just as a thought of joy flashed through Klein's mind, he saw a new word in mercury color appear on the unfilled brass page. This meant that 0-02 had finally diverted a portion of its power from its vicious cycle. It was preparing to add text as a supplementary explanation to fix the flaws. Leave. Without any hesitation, Klein shouted. Biles strictly obeyed the orders of a high-leveled figure, immediately withdrawing his right hand, turning around, and sprinting out the window. Make a move to attack me. Seeing that the sailor with dual attributes had left the city library, Klein suddenly added. Byles's heart was filled with puzzlement, but he still raised his right arm and pulled back his shoulder. He put on a stance that looked like he was about to throw a punch at Klein. At this moment, a new article finally took shape. With regards to the rules above, the Trunsoist Brass Book and the group of people it permits have immunity while enforcing the law. However, even if this article was successfully published, Byles wouldn't suffer any punishment. Clearly, the Trunsoist Brass Book wouldn't pursue problems that led to a vicious cycle or unclear definitions. It was just like how it didn't pile crimes on roads after it mended the loopholes in the rules. By the same logic, Byles, who had truly come into contact with 0-02, didn't suffer any contamination from a Sapphira. Before the supplementary clauses were published, Byles was a part of the Belton. He couldn't be damaged in any sense, so he couldn't be corrupted. But with the additional clause, he wouldn't be retroactively punished for his previous actions. In fact, after Byles left the city library, he had violated the curfew order as well, but Klein had already noticed a problem. It was that when the Belton citizens pursued foreigners while outside, they weren't restricted by the curfew. Therefore, he made Byles attack him in a manner to avoid the corresponding punishment. Right on the heels of that, he seized the opportunity while 0-02 was fixing the loophole to quickly recall the detailed information regarding the Trunsoist Brass Book. This book possesses a living characteristic, but most of the time, it's at a very low level. The first half of the book displays almost all the underlying rules, while the second half is blank. It needs to be filled in autonomously. Once there are no restrictions, it will naturally set up laws with certain biases for the surrounding areas and strictly enforce it. During this process, it will change and correct the rules based on the feedback. As the law gradually becomes stricter, his living characteristic will deepen. Once a law that can interfere with all aspects takes form, the Trunsoist Brass Book will completely come alive. It will possess true intelligence, and has the ability to modify the first half of the underlying rules to a certain extent. The exact extent that it can reach is as follows. If there are contradictions in the laws that can't be corrected, or if the pages are all filled without being able to form a sufficiently airtight system of rules, the Trunsoist Brass Book will produce a new line at the boundary between the first and second half. All the following rules are ineffective. After this line takes form, the rules in the second half will disappear and the pages will return to a blank slate. After the second half is completely blank, the clause, "all the following rules are ineffective," will be erased, and the Trunsoist Brass Book will repeat its previous actions until there is a set of laws that covers all aspects. The rules that it creates have to be publicized or informed to the masses before having them take effect. When there's no clear rule for a particular action, whether it's against the common knowledge of the surrounding living beings. Trunsoist Brass Book hates distorted and ugly rules. It hates having loopholes found. What a detailed description. There should be a method to seal 0-02 in all of this. Klein's thoughts raced as he attempted to find information that he could use from every line of text. At this moment, the leader of the ascetics, Ariana, whispered, "Think of a way to fill the pages behind 0-02, without making it airtight enough." That's right. In that case, the Trunsoist Brass Book will declare that all the following rules are ineffective. It'll redo it again. When that happens, its restrictions on the surroundings will temporarily vanish, allowing us to have the chance to touch it, take it away, or directly pray to a deity. But, how should we go about doing this? The Trunsoist Brass Book hates distorted and ugly rules. It hates having loopholes found. Klein's heart stirred as he had an idea. Without any hesitation, he stretched out his arms, as if he was hugging the air. In the next second, inside the building whose dimensions had shrunk to 1/10 of the original Belton City Library, a hall that was covered with deep black stone slabs with all kinds of scuffing descended into the real world. There were 8 black stone pillars erected in the hall, and metal poles hung from the high dome. At the bottom were candlesticks carved into different creatures, 41 on the left and 40 on the right. This was the Tudor Trunsoist United Empire's Hall of Consuls that Klein had seen before. At that time, both consuls were still Sequence 1 Princes of Abolition of the Black Emperor pathway, so this place was filled with distortions. It didn't match the normal circumstances and didn't have any rules of aesthetics. Apart from that, when Klein summoned this historical scene, he also used his domain's ability to add the details of the fourth epoch which he knew. It made the order that stemmed from the Black Emperor become more and more detailed, as though it was corporeal. Pa! His wrists were severed as they landed on the ground. Blood spurted out from the wound, just like an ordinary person. This was the second time Klein had committed fraud. The two palms and fresh blood that gushed to the ground quickly separated into transparent maggots and sticky, nearly shapeless liquid. As the worms of spirit convulsed and died, Klein grimaced due to the pain as he made numerous worms crawl out from the stump to form new palms. At the same time, he tried his best to maintain the scene he had created through multiple summonings, not letting it dissipate. On the rectangular table, inside the book that had bound brass pages, many new lines of text appeared. All buildings and structures have to follow the golden ratio and principles of symmetry. Strange clothes are not permitted. The following crimes have the death penalty. The Trunsoist brass book flipped through the pages quickly as it targeted the laws that stemmed from a black emperor. The further it went, the faster the new text appeared. There were no more pauses that lasted nearly a minute. Inside the hall, the candlesticks that fell from the ceiling broke and disappeared. Then, the other parts of the hall experienced various changes, wiping away the original details of the order one by one. Finally, the hall could no longer be maintained. It collapsed and returned to the historical void. At that moment, the Trunsoist brass book had already flipped to the last 2 pages. It was spread out there without any movement. With the last page filled with text and no longer able to form a tight system of rules with what 0-02 had previously set, Klein silently exhaled and relaxed a little. He felt that his spirituality was almost depleted. Let's wait for an hour at Byles's house. He turned his head and said to Ariana. If they stayed where they were, they would suffer increasingly severe punishments from breaking the curfew until they were sentenced to death. As for monitoring the Trunsoist brass book, this mission that couldn't allow for mistakes was naturally handed over to a Rhodes. Although this magic mirror couldn't directly look at 0-02, it could pay attention to the notice board and determine the disappearance progress of the laws on it. Chapter 1289 Fooling. After returning to Byles's house, Klein pulled a chair over and sat down without waiting for Roy and company to make inquiries. He made a rather pious wish: I wish for my spirituality to be restored. With that said, he raised his right hand, snapped his fingers, and granted his own wish, thus, allowing his spirituality to return to its normal state. Right on the heels of that, he extended his left palm, preparing to end the maintenance of the historical projection of the curtain before summoning a new one, so as to continue sealing off the spirit world area corresponding to Belton City. This prevented the Church of the God of Combat's chief shepherd, Larian, from escaping. There's no need to do so. There's always a next time. At that moment, Ariana slowly shook her head, indicating that Klein no longer needed to summon the curtain that originated from the dark demonic wolf. There was a limit to the power of wishes. A miracle invoker couldn't satisfy the same wish in a short period of time, which meant that, within the next 1 or 2 hours, Klein couldn't recover his spirituality by granting his own wishes. Of course, to a qualified seer pathway angel, this limitation was something that could be avoided. For example, he could get Pasha, Roy, Byles, and Ariana to take turns to wish for Klein to regain his spirituality before granting their wishes as a miracle invoker. However, the problem was that, even if he could recover his spirituality that many times, he wouldn't be able to maintain the curtain, which was at the level of a sequence 1 for more than an hour. Furthermore, he needed to wait an hour before 0-02 erased all the previous rules and rewrote them. After some deliberation, Klein nodded slightly and replied with a smile, "Let's give it a try first. After all, we're rather free right now. I'll give up after my last spirituality recovery attempt. Yes, this will purely depend on the chief shepherd's luck. Perhaps he might lose control because of anxiety, frustration, and nervousness." As he spoke, Klein dispelled the maintenance of the original curtain, and his left hand moved forward immediately after that. He pulled out a new curtain, allowing it to appear inside the spirit world that corresponded to Belton City. In an area where saturated colors overlapped one another, Larian, who was wearing a black robe with white edges and a square hat, felt the restriction disappear. Just as he was about to make his way out, he saw a new curtain descend, sealing him off again. The smile on his face instantly froze. Phew. A few seconds later, Larian slowly exhaled and composed himself mentally as he continued to wait. In the next hour, the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat repeatedly experienced the despair and pain of having his hopes extinguished. He attempted to find the pattern and attempt to figure out the time interval so as to grasp the fleeting opportunity. He wanted to rush out of the barrier the moment the old curtain disappeared and before the new curtain was produced. However, he eventually discovered that the intervals didn't follow any pattern. The person stopping him didn't restore the barrier only when his spirituality was about to be depleted. At times, the other party would recreate the barrier far ahead of time. If it wasn't for the fact that Phaeacian citizens weren't forced to change faiths from the God of Combat, and that the decree that Larian was considered a traitor hadn't been widely spread, this grounded angel might have already lost control on the spot. As time passed, Larian once again sensed the collapse of the old curtain. However, this time, there was no new curtain. He has finally reached his limit. Larian was delighted. Without any hesitation, he rushed out of the collapsing nascent divine kingdom. In the next moment, he saw a woman holding 4 blonde, red-eyed heads, dressed in a complicated long dress, an unknown existence that was wrapped in bandages with yellowish-brown liquid covering the entire, and several strange but abnormally powerful spirit world creatures. The curtain that Klein had summoned the previous times were historical void projections that had been tainted with Sapphira Castle's aura. It naturally attracted objects sensitive to it. He wouldn't even be surprised if Amon was among the group. The smile on Larian's face froze again. Belton City, in Biles's rental apartment. Klein suddenly raised his head and looked up into the sky. He muttered softly, "Impressive." Following that, he became silent again until the magic mirror emitted an aqueous light that reflected the noticeboard's current state. The rules on the paper disappeared in reverse order of their appearance. This meant that 0-02 was beginning to erase the rules that it had set up, and was preparing to redo everything. Once the curfew order was abolished, the highly focused Klein immediately pulled Ma'am Ariana and used Flaming Jump to appear outside the shrunken Belton City Library. As he looked over, he realized that, on the brass pages of 0-02, the speed at which the rules were being wiped clear had become very fast. In just a blink of an eye, the second half of the book was only left with the clause, "All the following rules are ineffective." Following that, the clause disappeared as a new set of rules rapidly emerged without any gaps. The Trunsoist brass book is the most precious item. No living being is permitted to touch it. Before this clause was completed, Ariana's figure had already appeared beside the rectangular table. Her finger touched the brass page. With a crack, the leader of the Church of Evernights ascetic had her neck suddenly constricted as though an invisible rope had hoisted her up. As an angel, she had actually suffered bone fractures and had difficulties breathing. Death by hanging. However, with Ariana's finger sliding over with some difficulty, the first clause that appeared was erased before it was fully displayed. It entered a concealed state. As for all the rules set by 0-02, it had to be publicized or announced before it could truly be effective. With a whoosh, Ariana picked up the Trunsoist brass book and threw it to Klein, who was outside the window. In the previous hour, Klein had already anticipated all the possible developments and had a discussion with Ariana. He was in no way nervous or flustered. While 0-02 was still in midair, he dragged another himself wearing a human-skinned glove out of the void. Then, he grabbed the Trunsoist brass book and used his historical projection to teleport away. After his figure disappeared from his spot, Ariana landed on the ground with a loud thud, a deep mark left on her neck. In just a few seconds, Klein, who was holding 0-02, appeared at the top of the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range. He used his spirit vision at the level of an angel and saw the collapsed, dilapidated, and fogged palace. Without any hesitation, Klein allowed his historical projection to take the Trunsoist brass book and blink to the main door of the palace before pushing the door open. What appeared before him was a hall with many corpses hanging from above. Every corpse was different. There were men and women either dressed beautifully, simply, exquisitely, or casually. Behind each of these hangers was a transparent and slippery tentacle with complicated patterns. They came from the depths of the hall, from that ancient stone chair. On the huge stone chair, transparent and distorted maggots were formed into a ball. They grew wantonly and extended out strange tentacles. This was the half-fool of the Antigonus family, who had lost control and gone mad. Sensing the door open, and sensing Klein's historical projection approach, the cluster of maggots left the stone chair and fiercely flailed their slippery tentacles, causing them to surge towards the door as if they were being affected by an invisible suction force. Similarly, at the bottom of the stone chair, the tarot card with Roselle's image, which was written with a stellar radiance, flew towards the door. Just seeing this scene pushed Klein's historical projection towards experiencing a breakdown. Thankfully, he didn't possess any sentience and was remotely controlled by Klein. He didn't suffer the chaotic thoughts and the negative side effects of the mental mutation, nor did he stand motionless and helpless. Before the historical projection dissipated, it threw the Trunsoist brass book at the terrifying cluster of maggots. The transparent and slippery tentacles sensed danger and instinctively reacted by wrapping around sealed artifact 0-02. Under such interference and the invisible strong winds, the Fool card had reached the door one step ahead of the strange tentacles. Klein's historical projection had mostly collapsed. Seeing this, he mechanically extended his right hand, grabbed the card of blasphemy, and threw it behind him. In the next instant, the slippery tentacles that were reassembled had reached out to the door, but they were blocked by the fog, unable to exit. All it could do was wildly pound at the barrier. The open door slowly closed, blocking out this scene. Klein, who was hiding somewhere on the mountain peak, frowned slightly. He felt a sense of joy and relief, as well as a strong sense of doubt. In other words, I used 0-02 to exchange for the Fool's card? The goddess doesn't need me to seek clues regarding the river of eternal darkness for the time being? Klein silently muttered to himself. He walked out of the hidden area and arrived not far from the ancient palace. He bent down and picked up the card of blasphemy. On the surface of the card was Roselle Gustave, who was wearing colorful clothes and holding a stick and luggage. His eyes were filled with a longing for the future, and behind him was a puppy. On the upper left corner of the card, the resplendent stellar radiance outlined a few words, Sequence 0, the Fool. Inside the ancient palace, the Trunsoist brass book fell to the ground and opened up to the first page of the second half of the book. New rules began to form. The Trunsoist brass book is the most precious item. No living being is permitted to touch it. Those in violation are to be sentenced to death. One is not allowed to change the condition of the Trunsoist brass book in any way. Those in violation are to be sentenced to death. Just as the two rules just appeared, and before it could inform the owner here, a line of words suddenly appeared between the two halves of the book. All the following rules are ineffective. An hour later, the 2 rules were wiped out, and new rules were written. However, after just 2 lines, there was an additional clause in front of them. 0-02 seemed to have reached a blank slate that happened when the entire book was filled up. Again and again, the Trunsoist brass book fell into an endless cycle. Chapter 1290 Fulfilling Wishes. Putting away the Fool card, Klein took out Creeping Hunger from the void, equipped it to his left hand, and activated Teleport. After returning to the miniaturized city library, he immediately said to the Servant of Concealment, Ariana, "It has been thrown into the abandoned palace on the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range." That was an entrance to the foggy town. As for how to deal with 0-02 later on, it was the Church of Evernight's problem. "All right." Ariana nodded and didn't say anything else. She entered a concealed state and vanished, as though she had been erased. She didn't thank him, nor mention any payment. It was just like how she had never made any requests when she helped Klein in the past. "Does Ma'am Ariana know that I've obtained the Fool card?" Klein looked around thoughtfully and slowly sighed in the darkness. Although the supernatural incident had been resolved in less than 2 hours, there were still quite a number of people who had lost their lives under the strict rules. The Belton citizens had more or less committed certain mistakes, but the punishments they suffered were far more disproportionate to the crimes they had committed. The most innocent party in the matter were the tourists who came or passed by Belton. They had to face a nightmare simply because they were foreigners. Klein had tried his best to do some things to protect many outsiders, including Roy and the others, but he was also limited in what he could do due to the restrictions he suffered. There weren't many loopholes that could be made use of, making it impossible to make it seem like none of that had ever happened. What I need to do next is to mainly provide treatment to the survivors. Klein retracted his gaze and planned on teleporting to Biles's house to deal with the remaining problems. At that moment, Rionette Tynker, who was holding 4 blonde, red-eyed heads and was wearing a dark and complicated long dress, walked out of the void. One of the heads bit onto a black goat's horn. "He escaped the spirit world," the remaining 3 heads of Miss Messenger said. As expected of a former chief shepherd. Klein, who had long sensed it, sighed without any surprise. Then, he pointed at the black goat's horn. "Did Larian leave that behind?" After Klein received the item, Rionette Tynker's head that hadn't spoken earlier said, "Yes." After encountering the curse of deformity, he had still managed to barge out of the encirclement and escape from the spirit world. He is indeed powerful. Is this a Sequence 2 angel who's best at fighting head-on? Klein flicked his wrist, causing the black goat horn in his palm to shatter into countless tiny specks of light as it dissipated, dispersing the remnant psyche. The limbs left behind by a Beyonder after them undergoing a transformation contain a portion of their Beyonder characteristics that couldn't return to the main body. When the points of light were reassembled from Sequence 9 to Sequence 7, as well as a Sequence 4 Beyonder characteristic, Klein chose the Sequence 8 Pugilist from it and returned the rest to Miss Messenger with a smile. "These are your spoils. I'll only collect the intelligence fee." Rionette Tynker didn't stand on ceremony. She raised one of the blonde, red-eyed heads and had it open its mouth, absorbing the Sequence 9, Sequence 7, and Sequence 4 Warrior Beyonder characteristics. After watching Miss Messenger leave Belton, Klein teleported back to Biles's home and smiled at Roy and company. "The problem has been resolved. You are no longer foreigners who have to be treated with animosity." The 4 Beyonders were just about to respond with heartfelt and relieved smiles when they saw the magical Mr. Magician invite a stranger from the air. It was an old man with a dark red bow tie. He wore a shirt, vest, formal suit, and blue striped trousers. His hair remained thick despite it being all white. His aura was warm and elegant. This was the marionette, Vin Rambus, whom Klein had once possessed. He planned on using this manipulator to seal away their memories of 0-02. Not being corrupted by a Sapphira didn't mean that Biles wouldn't encounter terrifying matters when he recollected the matter. As there was only one relevant period of memory for Biles, and he didn't know the truth of the matter, what Klein needed to do was rather simple. Therefore, he didn't seek Miss Justice's help. He planned on using his marionette's historical void projection to complete it. You didn't tell them about what happened in the city library, right? Klein got Vin Rambus to walk to his side as he asked Biles. Biles hurriedly shook his head and said, I remember your advice. Very good. Next, I'll give you some psychological treatment. I'll help you forget all those matters. Otherwise, you'll be targeted by 0-02 and never be able to obtain peace until you die. Believe me, sealed artifacts at this level can definitely do something like that, even if it has been taken away. Klein explained his goal frankly. Biles's lips quivered as he said, all right. He chose to obey and believe. After inviting Roy, Pasha, and Phil out of this rental apartment, Klein controlled Vin Rambus to do a series of mental control processes and successfully made Biles forget the brass book he had seen, as well as the contents on it. After doing this, Klein carefully took out the magic mirror and looked at it. Rhodes, are there any other hidden dangers? On the surface of the ancient silver mirror, the aqueous light flickered and reflected a line of silver words, Great Master, there aren't any latent risks in Belton. As for other places in Lone and Faysac, as it involves 0-02 itself, I'm unable to see it clearly. Perhaps you can confirm it yourself? All right. Klein nodded slightly, took out a gold coin, and softly chanted the corresponding divination statement. With a ping, the gold coin flicked up and tumbled in the air. During this process, scenes naturally surfaced in Klein's mind. They were chimneys, streets, and cities. They were extremely vague and lacked specific directions. With a slight frown, he collected his thoughts and reached out to catch the gold coin. Then, he got Pasha and the others to return to Biles's home. He smiled and said to Roy, didn't you wish to obtain the next potion? You can make a wish now. Roy's eyes revealed surprise and he asked nervously, I can still make another wish. This is a gift, Klein replied with a smile. Roy's heart stirred. Without asking any more questions, he seized this opportunity to fulfill his wish of obtaining the next potion. Klein then threw the Warrior Pathways Sequence 8 Pugilist Beyonder characteristic to him. This is essentially a potion, but for safety, I suggest you search for the corresponding formula and find the correct supplementary ingredients. Your amazing feats are worthy of praise. Roy expressed his gratitude. His first potion had, in some sense, been a Warrior Beyonder characteristic that he devoured. As the apocalypse was approaching, along with his relatively low sequence and good luck, he didn't lose control on the spot. He didn't even have any serious psychological problems. After that, he gradually came into contact with other Beyonders and came into contact with true mysticism. Only then did he learn how dangerous his actions were, and he didn't dare make a similar attempt again. Faced with Roy's praise, Klein looked around and smiled. Next, follow me out of Belton. This doesn't mean that there's still danger here, but I have to make use of this time to fulfill your wishes. One wish involved Roy hoping that Klein could help them leave the Belton, while the other wish involved Pasha's wish to have Klein protect them and allow them to leave Belton City alive. Although these two matters were meaningless under the present situation, to Klein, he had to fulfill the wish even if there was no point in doing it. I'm just a heartless, wish-granting machine. Klein lampooned himself as he smiled at Biles and company. Pasha and the others glanced at each other, not daring to raise any objections. Just like before, they held each other's hands. Then, Klein brought them to the outskirts of Belton with teleportation. The magic show has come to an end. It's time to say goodbye. Klein took off his hat and bowed. He tried his best to make himself a true wandering magician. This was a habit of his acting. Upon seeing this, Pasha blurted out, "Can we know your name?" Klein smiled and said, I have too many names. Different people have different names for me. You can call me the miracle magician, Merlin Hermes. Mr. Hermes, are you a believer of the Evernight goddess? Roy asked after some hesitation. For a moment, Klein didn't know how to answer. He really wanted to say that he once was, but not anymore. After some consideration, he decided to act as an attendant of mysteries in advance. He immediately restrained his smile and solemnly said, The one I serve is the Fool, the Lord of the Mysteries, the great ruler above the spirit world. If you wish to believe in this mighty existence, or wish to gain more of an understanding, you can go to the Sonia Sea's Rorsted archipelago. The Lord's missionary, Danitz, is currently preaching there. Furthermore, the City of Silver definitely has all the potion formulas from the warrior pathway under Sequence 2. Klein silently added, but he didn't say it out loud. Roy nodded slightly and said, It's my first time knowing of such a mighty existence in this world. Your miraculous nature has shown his brilliance. He didn't directly respond to Mr. Merlin Hermes because he was still hesitant. Pasha, Biles, and Phil were the same. Without another word, Klein turned around and left the four Beyonders, before making a detour to Belton. He didn't forget his purpose in alighting at this tiny city. He planned on immediately finding a room to study the Fool card above the grey fog. In a city in mid-seashore, at a particular library. A young law researcher took out a book from the bookshelf and walked to a table by the window and sat down. As he carefully read through the book, he realized that there was a page of yellowish-brown paper in it. What is this? The young law researcher muttered to himself in confusion and reached out to pull out the paper. After confirming that it was written in ancient Faesac, the content was rather rare. In the fourth epoch, there was a book named the Trunsoist Brass Book. Chapter 1291 Two Rituals Above the Grey Fog. In the ancient palace, Klein's figure appeared. At that moment, on the high-back chair belonging to the Fool sat a person shrouded in grayish-white fog. As Klein returned to Sapphira Castle, this person instantly disintegrated, turning into transparent and distorted worms of spirit that flew to Klein and entered his body. Thankfully, the restrictions placed by 0-02 only involved no leaking of secrets or returning. I didn't have my connection with the worms of spirit that were guarding Sapphira Castle severed. Otherwise, they would have already lost control and become monsters. Klein sighed inwardly as he sat at the seat belonging to the Fool and picked up the Fool card he had previously sacrificed to himself. As the card of blasphemy had already been activated, there was no need for him to seek out any additional incantations. All he needed to do was inject spirituality into it to see the corresponding changes. The Fool card quickly transformed into a miniature, illusory book. With Klein's guidance, it kept flipping back until it reached the last 2 pages. Sequence 1, Attendant of Mysteries. This is an angel who serves the profound mysteries. He has gained initial control of the corresponding domain's authorities. He can summon spirit body threads of objects that originally existed. He can combine many physical objects or abstract concepts together. The potion formula is as follows: main ingredients, 1 attendant of mysteries beyonder characteristic. Supplementary ingredients, 9 spirit world specialties. Advancement ritual, build a town consisting only of marionettes, and design a trajectory of fate for every marionette. By letting them interact with each other, they would act as a sufficiently real-life painting and create a corresponding area in the spirit world. The larger the town, the more the marionettes involved, the more detailed the daily lives are, and the more realistic and extensiveness the different fates are, the better the ritual's effects would be. Sequence 0, the Fool. This is a true deity. In a sense, he is an embodiment of the corresponding authorities. He is adept at using all kinds of methods to fool all things, showcasing all kinds of fascinating miracles. The potion formula is as follows: main ingredients, the uniqueness of the Fool. 2. Attendant of mysteries beyond her characteristics apart from one's characteristic. Supplementary ingredients: control at least a quarter of the fog of history. Advancement ritual: full time, history, or fate once. As he read, Klein slowly frowned and silently muttered to himself, compared to the advancement ritual of Attendant of Mysteries, the Fool's ritual is just too abstract. What does it mean to fool time, history, or fate? How does one decide if it's successful? Controlling at least a quarter of the fog of history is relatively simple for me. On the one hand, I know a lot of ancient secrets and have lit up many historical fragments. On the other hand, I can directly influence the fog of history through Sapphira Castle. I'll put the fool's matter aside for now. Currently, my focus is on Attendant of Mysteries. You have to walk one step at a time before running is possible. Of course, some lucky ones can fly directly. It's very easy to find the 9 specialties in the spirit world. Be it to get Miss Messenger to help, or to seek the 7 lights' advice, this isn't a problem. The advancement ritual is very close to the environment around Zerodol and the Antigonus family's ancestor. Furthermore, it matches what the 7 lights said about having a close connection with the spirit world. I can determine it to be true for now. With this in mind, Klein took off the topaz pendant wrapped around his left wrist and used divination to confirm the authenticity of the Attendant of Mysteries potion formula. It wasn't that he didn't believe in Emperor Roselle, but his fellow countrymen had likely been influenced by Mr. Dor before he created the cards of blasphemy. He had gone to the moon and suffered the corruption and contamination of the mother goddess of depravity, thus, resulting in distorted memories. It was precisely because of this that it was highly possible that Roselle had buried some traps in the key areas of the cards of blasphemy in his final days. In this aspect, Klein had always been cautious and careful. Speaking of the primordial moon's true form, the most powerful Great Old One, the mother goddess of depravity, could it be that the emperor had unknowingly been tainted based on her title? On the moon, perhaps there are many younger brothers and sisters that Bernadette has never met before. Of course, it's unlikely that there are gender differences. The marionettes needed for the Attendant of Mysteries ritual can be obtained from the forsaken land of the gods. The copious number of monsters there is a good thing. Furthermore, I've accumulated quite a few of them previously. As Klein's thoughts wandered, he turned his head to look at the other side of the ancient palace and made the grayish-white fog beside the junk pile dissipate. As the fog receded, rows of brownish-yellow seats appeared, each of which sat a figure. Those figures were either giants covered in silver armor, humans with deformed facial features in linen clothes, and large chunks of flesh overgrown with eyes. They sat quietly in their rows of seats, their eyes glazed over and indifferent as they stared in the direction of the long model table. These were all marionettes that Klein had gathered in the forsaken land of the gods. Every time he needed to switch location, and it wasn't convenient for him to carry too many with him, he would sacrifice a batch of them above the gray fog. Of course, this had nothing to do with environmental protection. Instead, it was what had happened to the foggy town and the scene displayed by Zerodol. It made Klein instinctively believe that there was a high chance that a particular ritual would require many marionettes. Therefore, he had always been very frugal in this aspect. As for why he didn't hang these marionettes up, and had made them sit in rows in a conjured theater as members of the audience, this was because Klein felt that the actions of the Antigonus family's ancestor and Zerodol were a little perverse. He had tried to imitate and mimic them, but the goal was for acting. Now, he didn't need it anymore. But how can such a marionette city produce corresponding spirit world information? The spirit world is a gathering of the past, present, and future information, but it doesn't directly include such fake objects. Generated from what others know. Every living being's actions and words would be reflected in the spirit world in an abstract manner, becoming the source of divination. When their actions, words, and certain intense feelings are clearly built into a marionette city, the city's spirit world projection would appear, turning into a true existence. The interactions involved in this are linked to the more profound secrets of the spirit world. Klein closed the Fool card in thought and played with it. As he had already reached the angel level, he had a certain understanding regarding the creation of the cards of blasphemy. Back then, not only was Roselle able to draw powers from knowledge, but he could also give actual powers to abstract knowledge. As for what kind of material the Emperor used to create it, and how he accomplished the effects of anti-divination and anti-prophecy at the level of deities, Klein was unable to figure it out. After some thought, Klein tried to accommodate the Fool card in his body. His condition immediately changed. His body was covered with colorful clothes, and there was an extremely gorgeous piece of headwear on his head. His aura was deep and terrifying, but it gave off a comical, ridiculous, ludicrous feeling. It was a condition filled with a strange conflict. The space attached to Sapphira Castle gently swayed, as though it wanted to surrender to the feet of this indescribable deity. My level has been enhanced a little. There aren't any substantial changes. After all, I'm already the owner of Sapphira Castle. Heh, it's like I have a fashionable costume that can accentuate my aura. Klein shook his head and said a few self-deprecating words. At the same time, a transparent and distorted worm of spirit crawled out from his body, forming a figure that was identical to him. After splitting off a worm of spirit of himself that could respond to prayers at any moment, Klein returned to the real world and strolled around Belton City. He used the method of granting wishes to treat the injuries of people, and he learned about the war from them. Dogs hit. Danitz couldn't help but curse when he heard the crew's report. They actually finished the whale oil? Why didn't you stop them? As they passed by the Gargas archipelago, Danitz and his crew bought a batch of whale oil that hadn't been refined. They planned on bringing it back to Byam and selling it at a high price. Who would have expected that a portion of it had been secretly eaten by the City of Silver's half-giants? The crew member glanced at the oracle and whispered, "They don't understand what we're talking about." We don't understand what they're talking about either. Only the shortest one can communicate, but it doesn't mean we can find him at any time. He always cogitates in places where the sun shines, changing positions every time. Danitz subconsciously sneered. This is what happens to illiterates. If you could grasp all sorts of languages like ancient Faesak, Jotun, and Elvish like me, something like that wouldn't have happened. Of course, linguistic talent is related to intelligence. You don't have to force yourself. The crewman carefully looked at Danitz again. Oracle, they ate the portion of whale oil you bought, dogs hit. Danitz's reaction was faster than his thoughts as he rushed towards the cabin. After a period of chaos, Danitz received compensation with a sequence 8 Beyonder characteristic. He didn't know if he had profited or suffered a loss. After all, the dirty bodily fluids left on the characteristic made him feel disgusted and nauseous. By the time the ship returned to peace, City of Generosity, Byam, was already in front of the City of Silver's reconnaissance team. Derek led Lievel, Candace, and the others to the deck and looked at the destination of their journey. Although they had passed by many ports, they had never been allowed to alight from the ship. They could only watch from afar. Now, it was finally time for them to step onto the land outside. Even so, the large number of people, houses, and hardships that they had seen from afar were still unable to conceal their bubbling enthusiasm. They continued to yearn for life in the world of light. Of course, having been used to the darkness and lightning, they took quite some time before they could get used to the sun outside. If not for the fact that they were Beyonders, they would have suffered permanent damage to their eyes. As he looked at the docks and the numerous people, the airships that were traveling high in the sky, and the other ships around him while hearing noises that he could barely understand, Derek suddenly felt a sense of nervousness. This would be the area where the City of Silver would take up residence in the future. As he swept his gaze, he suddenly saw a man standing on the coastal lighthouse. He was wearing a long robe embroidered with the symbol of storm. His hair was dark blue, nearly black, like a clump of seaweed. His face was rough and carved. As their gazes met, Derek instantly calmed down and no longer felt uneasy. Chapter 1292. Entering Byam. For the first time after the huge ship belonging to the Resistance docked, all of the City of Silver citizens changed into round-neck shirts, brown jackets, pantaloons, and dark-colored caps before following Oracle Danitz down the ship. They prepared to pass through the dock to enter the City of Generosity Byam. Those clothes had been prepared beforehand. It's really uncomfortable wearing this. It's not suitable for battle. As he walked, Lievel moved his limbs and whispered to Elder Derek. Derek nodded slightly and said, "But it's better to hide ourselves and not be too eye-catching. We don't want to become the focus of attention." Derek's analysis wasn't a problem at all. After all, they were outsiders and they only numbered 21 people. It was best if they didn't attract the attention of others, but he seemed to have forgotten a crucial detail. But, they're all looking at us. Candace quickly surveyed the area and whispered. The workers who were dressed crudely or half-naked at the pier all looked over at the tourists who wore all kinds of get-ups. They're tall. A Byam resident with bronze skin and slightly curly hair could not help but sigh. His height was only around 160. This was the height of all the male commoners in the current colonial era. As for the people of the City of Silver, other than Derek, who was only slightly over 2 meters tall, the rest were on average above 2.3 meters. The tallest of them exceeded 2.5 meters. To have such half-giants walk through the docks amidst the crowd was equally eye-catching no matter what they wore. Phasacians? A Loanese in a top hat and formal suit turned his head to gossip with his companion. Has the slave trade begun again? He believed that the City of Silver entourage were Phasacian slaves that the Rorsted government had bought from the Lone Kingdom. After all, in this world, the only ones he could think of who had such heights in such numbers were the barbarians who claimed to be descendants of giants. His partner shook his head and frowned. It doesn't seem like the case. Most Phasacians have light blue eyes. Furthermore, even if they are Phasacian, few of them exceed 2 meters in height. Unless these are nobles or high-ranking prisoners of war, although Phasac didn't have a clear rule, in all kinds of industries, especially in the military, there was a phenomenon that one's height determined one's status. Of course, this wasn't the only condition. It was also a combination of family background, nobility, and ranks. Due to such traditions, the descendants of Phasacian royalty and the military brass were generally taller than 2 meters. This was actually a superficial phenomenon that, at its essence, was an influence of their beyonder characteristics. Those who became one of the brass of the Phasac military were either nobles or at least sequence 5. And for the latter, due to the repeated influence of the giant pathways potions, their height would definitely reach the standard height. Those who chose the Red Priest pathway would also have a certain increase in height. However, the signs weren't as obvious in their early stages as those from the giant pathway, and the total increase in height was only a few centimeters. They had to become a demigod to experience a qualitative change. For noble descendants, their ancestors were more or less giants, or had marital alliances with giants. Regardless of whether they inherited the beyonder characteristics, the corresponding genes accumulated over generations would definitely allow their normal height to exceed 2 meters. Among them, families who were still in control of a portion of the giant pathways potion formulas, and those who had a certain heritage, tend to be in the same situation as the residents of the City of Silver. The royal family in charge of the Red Priest pathway maintained the heights of their descendants through marital alliances. The residents of the City of Silver, who were being scrutinized by numerous gazes, felt increasingly uneasy. It was as if they had returned to the cursed land where they were being watched by monsters as they walked in the dark. Derek was very calm and composed. He looked around and said to the members of the reconnaissance team, "They don't have any ill intentions. After confirming that Mr. Hanged Man was in this city and how he knew that he had arrived, Derek no longer felt isolated and helpless. It wasn't that he didn't trust the messenger that Mr. Fool had appointed, but that he believed that he didn't want to trouble a god as much as possible in his daily life. The best thing to do was resolve problems himself. And when it came to dealing with his own problems, Derek was ultimately unfamiliar with the outside world, so he wasn't too confident. At this moment, to have an experienced, trustable, extremely intelligent native with a meticulous mind help him would definitely be the best option. Of course, Derek also knew that Mr. Hanged Man wouldn't make any contact with him on the surface because he belonged to another faction. He wasn't a believer of Sea God, so if he acted too warmly over matters regarding the City of Silver, he was bound to be suspected. However, there will always be a proper reason and suitable opportunities to meet. Derek thought in anticipation. Amidst his thoughts, he and the members of the City of Silver's reconnaissance team followed Danitz out of the dock and arrived on the streets. Their vision suddenly broadened as they saw more people than before and heard all sorts of voices. To the people of the City of Silver, this was even more lively than the grandest harvest in their hometown. At a glance, there were countless people dressed in strange clothes with all kinds of unique characteristics. Some were in a hurry, others were strolling leisurely, and some were carrying large pieces of fruit. They used pipes to suck in the liquid, or held food that looked like the delicious pies on the ship, occasionally taking a bite. Apart from these, horse-like creatures that pulled carriages producing tinkling sounds, the metallic objects that moved extremely fast, and the smell of the various spices that filled the streets made people of the City of Silver feel like they had come to another world. And to them, this was indeed another world. Even though they were a little fearful and uneasy, and were not too used to such a scene, everyone could clearly feel the vibrancy of this scene. This was like the sunlight in one's soul, reflecting the sun in the sky. This is the place where we will live, battle, and reproduce in the future? Derek, Lievel, Candace, and the others subconsciously had similar thoughts. They felt a little uneasy but didn't reject any of it. Danitz looked at their faces which had been stunned silly by Byam's bustling scene in satisfaction as he inwardly muttered, "This is only Byam. If you were to go to Trier and Backlund, are you going to kneel down and kiss the ground?" This world-famous pirate controlled his urge to mock them, as he was now Mr. Fool's messenger. He couldn't ruin the image of a deity. After leading the City of Silver people to a rather luxurious hotel, Danitz gestured for the crew to handle the check-in as he spoke in fluent Jotun to his guests. "It's getting dark. We'll stay here for one night and leave the city tomorrow. The place where you will build your city has been arranged. It's on the other side of the forest. There's a natural harbor and a few roads that lead to Byam. Roads to this city. After that, we'll expand the main road and build a railway that leads to your city." Railway. Derek, who had studied during the tarot gathering, knew what it meant. He nodded gratefully and inwardly praised Mr. Fool once again. Danitz continued, "We've already helped you level the area, and left the space needed for some basic facilities such as water pipes and gas pipes. When you begin building houses, we'll send a team over to help with the matters. Also, the corresponding construction materials and temporary tents have been prepared for you. Thank Mr. Fool. There's also the help of the Church of the Lord of Storms in this matter. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to purchase so much material. However, they mainly did so to earn additional funds. The Rorstad new government hadn't been established for long, and its connections with the outside world weren't comprehensive enough. What they didn't expect was that the Church of the Lord of Storms had taken the initiative to provide help on the City of Silver's matter. Water pipes. Gas pipes. Derek gradually couldn't understand what was being said, but he still put on a pensive expression. There were a few times when Danitz nearly said the word "dog's hit" in passing. Without speaking another word, he introduced the hotel. "This is a hotel that Phasacians like to live in at Byam the most. The ceiling might be a little too low for you, but it won't be low enough to hit your heads. With that said, Danet smiled. At the end of this street is Red Theater, he revealed a smile that all men understood. However, the people of the City of Silver didn't understand. Seriously, the Emperor said that the most ancient human occupation is the selling of their bodies. They actually don't know what I'm talking about. The corners of Danet's mouth twitched as he gave up on the topic. After his second and third mates were done with the check-in, he led the entourage up to the second floor and assigned them their rooms. After doing this, he took out a stack of cards that he had long written, and he distributed them to the members of the City of Silver, who were scouting the area. Every card has a few words in the local language and the corresponding word in Jotun. If you need any services or food, you can ring the bell here. When the attendant comes over, show him the card. Of course, they might not be able to understand it, but they will definitely seek help from people who understand it. This was a simple and easy method to understand. The people of the City of Silver easily grasped how to use the cards, secretly excited that they could finally communicate with the people here. Following that, Danets demonstrated how to switch on the water and how to use the toilet, and how to light up the gas wall lamps. It made Derek, Lievel, and Candace feel like they had arrived at a divine kingdom. All it took to have water flow was to press a switch. A button was enough to wash away their excrement without leaving any stains. There was a lantern that kept emitting light once it was ignited. These were all things that they didn't dare to imagine in the past. And these things would become part of their new lives. By the time the City of Silver's members had gotten used to the hotel, the sky had completely darkened. Night had begun to rule the city. Although Derek and company had long confirmed that there was no danger of monsters attacking in the dark in the outside world, they were still instinctively afraid. Therefore, they would either emit light themselves or light up the gas wall lamps. At that moment, they saw gas lamps lighting up one after another on the streets, the houses, both near and far, outside the glass windows. These lights dispersed the darkness in their respective areas. In the eyes of the people of the City of Silver, the bright and dim lights were like the galaxy landing on the ground at night. Chapter 1293 Devil's Oil Painting in a warehouse that was being rebuilt in Pritz Harbor. Furs met her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham, once again a few days later. "Are you ready?" Dorian asked in a low voice. Back when they met, he had already informed Furs of the ritual requirement of the Apprentice Pathways sequence for Secret Sorcerer, so that she could make advanced preparations. "More or less. I should be able to satisfy the requirements," Furs replied without much confidence. The advancement ritual of a secret sorcerer was relatively simple, but in this case, simple was the antonym for complex, and not difficult. To Furs, she wished that it was something else. The ritual required the candidate to seal a demigod-level creature with clear animosity. The less external help one received, the better the ritual's effects. As for the target's level, as long as it wasn't lower than a demigod, it was fine. It had virtually no effect on the ritual. Upon hearing that, Dorian nodded and said, "That should be fine. That ritual is really difficult for a Sequence 5 Beyonder to complete it on their own. It's necessary to seek help at appropriate times, but you mustn't go overboard, such as exceeding the corresponding limitations. Otherwise, the ritual will definitely fail." The suggestion he had previously provided to Furs was to borrow a Grade 1 sealed artifact. It would be best if she didn't even hire a saint-level helper. Furs said vaguely, "I only plan on making a wish to Mr. Fool to increase the success rate of advancement after consuming the potion. This is closer to obtaining good luck when consuming the potion, rather than being blessed and protected while sealing the demigod creature. Other than that, I'll be using the painting that you mentioned." The painting wasn't a Grade 0 sealed artifact, the Scroll of God, but the Abraham family's Grade 1 sealed artifact. It was called Devil's Oil Painting. In the fourth epoch, when many members of the Abraham family had advanced to Sequence 4 Secret Sorcerer, they had created the oil painting to seal the corresponding demigod-level creatures. However, after being attacked by the Aurora Order and losing a lot of documents, Dorian Gray wasn't sure how many terrifying creatures were sealed in the Devil's Oil painting. He was only certain that there was definitely more than one sealed inside. His original plan was to release a demigod-level creature that was completely insane from the Devil's Oil painting, one that acted purely out of instinct. This could then be his student's ritual target. This made it much easier than dealing with a rational and intelligent saint. Furthermore, it was completely in line with the ritual's requirements, but he never expected Furs to directly borrow the Devil's Oil painting. Dorian frowned and reminded her, the Devil's Oil painting only has the effect of imprisonment and sealing. It doesn't have the ability to actively affect the target. In other words, you have to stuff a demigod-level creature into the Devil's Oil painting. Furs nodded, indicating that she knew this. Teacher, you mentioned that one's record ability isn't considered external help. Yes, Dorian Gray gave a definite answer. If her record powers were considered external help, almost no traveler could advance. After all, record was the core ability of the apprentice pathway before they became demigods. Once it was excluded, Furs would be left only with the means to flee, making it difficult for her to do anything to her enemies. In theory, that's the case. However, you can only record at most 5 demigod-level powers, Dorian said worriedly. Before he finished his sentence, he thought of Mr. Fool and his blessed and felt a little more at ease. If the powers are matched well, it isn't impossible for me to succeed. It's just a mad creature that's acting on instinct. Furs tried convincing both her teacher and herself. Dorian nodded indiscernibly and didn't say anything else. He immediately summoned his contracted creature, Malmouth, who loved music, and took out the secret sorcerer main and supplementary ingredients. He then concocted a bottle of secret sorcerer potion for his student. If there's no way to complete the seal, there's no need to forcefully consume it. Even if the potion and glass bottle fuses together and turns into a sealed artifact, we can also pray to Mr. Fool to restore it to a Beyonder characteristic. Dorian continued to warn her worriedly before handing the potion to Furs. Inside the glass bottle were layers of stellar radiance, as though the Milky Way in the sky had been sucked into the potion. All right. Furs nodded heavily, indicating that she wasn't worried that the potion would be wasted. She had made plans ahead of time. She would immediately teleport away once she realized she couldn't seal the released demigod-level creature before making a wish to Mr. Fool and getting him to resolve it. Dorian then took out an oil painting from his suitcase, which was filled with abstract images. It was an image that no one could understand. Just looking at it would make one feel dizzy and mentally weak. This was the Devil's Oil painting that had sealed countless terrifying creatures. If you can successfully advance, I only have one request. Dorian held the Devil's Oil painting and said solemnly to Furs, that is, on the night of the full moon, listen to what Mr. Dor is saying and ask him the reasons for his actions. The members of the Abraham family still couldn't fully accept that the curse they had suffered from had stemmed from their ancestor. They felt that Mr. Dor might not know the consequences of his plea for help. They wished to figure out the full truth. All right. Faced with her teacher's sincere request, Furs agreed without any hesitation. Following that, she took the Devil's Oil painting, teleported out of Pritz Harbor, and came to a vast desert where no humans lived. This way, even if an accident happened during the ritual, she had plenty of time to resolve it and not affect ordinary people. After checking the surroundings and preparing herself, Furs inserted the Devil's Oil painting into the ground. She then clasped her hands together and bowed her head to pray to Mr. Fool. She wished that he could increase her chances of advancing after consuming the potion. Without any pause, she saw the illusory grayish-white fog and knew that Mr. Fool had already responded. After stalling for a few seconds, Furs finally convinced herself. She took out the herbal powder she had prepared, and she scattered it on the Devil's Oil painting. Then, she recited the incantation to release the seal in Jotun. This was an incantation that only released one creature. Without a sound, the powder that was floating in the air landed on the oil painting and rapidly spun around a central point. As it spun, the surface of the oil painting turned illusory as if a deep vortex was forming. Suddenly, a bluish-black hand emerged from the vortex, one that showed signs of decay. It stretched out from the oil painting to the outside world. Furza's body suddenly turned cold as though she had fallen into a frozen lake. While clearing up her mind, it also made her seem to lose control of her body. No matter how hard she tried, she was unable to move her limbs. At that moment, Furz seemed to return to her past state of writing books at night and sleeping during the day. At that time, she often felt that she had woken up, but she couldn't move at all. It was as though she was being pressed down by an invisible creature. Although the terrifying creature in the devil's oil painting had yet to fully escape, its influence on the outside world with its godhood made Furz lose most of her ability to resist. Once it fully escapes from the oil painting, Furz would even lose control merely from looking at it directly. The difference between the two in their lives' natural order was unimaginable in certain aspects. Gradually, Furza's consciousness blurred a little, having a nagging feeling that she was already lucid. She raised her arm and moved her feet, but on second thought, she realized that it was only her imagination. As her body turned colder, the feeling of being pressed down by an invisible creature became more obvious. Fortunately, she had a bunch of demigods providing her information, allowing her to close her eyes in time. She didn't look at the devil's oil painting, otherwise, the consequences would be dire. Using cogitation to maintain a certain level of clarity, Furz began counting down. According to Mr. World's warning, she knew that the terrifying creature would need 5 seconds to completely escape the devil's oil painting. 4. 3. 2. With just 1 second left, an illusory book appeared in Furza's eyes. It quickly flipped and stopped on 1 page. 1. Just as Furz finished counting, she suddenly spread open her arms. Around her, peach blossoms fell in a colorful resplendence. The bluish-black hand that was about to grab her neck moved away from her and was blocked by the peach forest that was blooming with vegetation and flowers. It was separated by a mountain that was the forest's river source, making it only possible for it to enter through a small cave. This was a fairy tale magic Furz had recorded from Mam Hermit. It was called Peach Blossom Source. It could create an isolation barrier from the outside world, making it very difficult for the outside world to connect to it. Seizing this opportunity, Furz, who barely managed to regain control of her body, took out a queen chess piece from Roselle's chess from a pocket and threw it at the source of the peach blossom scene, throwing it at the cave that penetrated through the flowing river. This was another fairy tale magic she had recorded, called the chessboard of time. Its effect was to slow the target's movements, as though it had entered a region in which time flowed slower. With a smack, the actions of the bluish-black palm that was trying hard to break through the peach blossom source changed from extending outwards to squirming. Furz didn't even look at the effects. She used an invisible hand to pick up the devil's oil painting that was stuck in the sand, and she held it right up to the cave. After 1 or 2 seconds, the bluish-black palm returned to normal. Its movements became extremely fast as it charged out of the peach blossom source and crashed into the oil painting. As the oil painting shook, the terrifying creature penetrated the surface and landed in it. Furz was delighted. Without any hesitation, she recited the incantation and closed the outer seal of the devil's oil painting. Thankfully, that demigod creature has already lost control. It's left with nothing but madness and lacks intelligence. I wonder if I will directly hear Mr. Door's shouts after consuming the potion. Still nervous, Furz took out the secret sorcerer potion bottle and poured it into her mouth. Chapter 1294 Conversation. If that demigod creature didn't slam into the devil's oil painting on its own accord, I'd have to summon Mr. World's historical void projection. I wonder if that can be considered as directly hiring a helper at the angel level. As Furs pondered, she drank the potion. To her, the potion was like icy water that could hurt someone due to the extreme temperature. All her senses vanished in the areas that it passed, leaving only her still thoughts. It was inevitable that a person would hallucinate in extreme cold temperatures. In Furz's vision, a night sky instantly appeared. It was dotted with countless stars that weaved together to form a dreamlike river. Furz's body began reflecting bits of stellar radiance as if they came from her own body. The tiny bits of pure stellar radiance formed an invisible connection with the different stars in the night sky. As the light shimmered, they twisted and squirmed as insect-like creatures crawled out of Furz's body. They wanted to seek refuge in the Milky Way formed by an array of embedded diamond shards. Each of them carried a portion of their own flesh and consciousness, as though they were uncontrollable avatars. Furz's thoughts quickly turned chaotic, and she fell into confusion. She almost couldn't control the urge to separate herself. At that moment, she sensed an illusory object. It was the seal that she had completed using the devil's oil painting. It was projected into the mysterious world created by the potion, forming an abstract, blurry mark. Furs didn't think further as she instinctively extended a portion of her consciousness along with her spirituality, and intertwined with the abstract symbol. The mark wasn't exactly harmonious with her, as if it wasn't part of her, but it managed to barely merge with her. Suddenly, in Furz's mind, the abstract symbol became rather clear. It consisted of a door that was layered with mysterious symbols. This door hid Furs behind it, allowing her to isolate herself from the surrounding cosmos. At the same time, on the other side of the door, the sealed creature seemed to sense the aura of an enemy. Using its own godhood, it wildly corroded the illusory door. It happened to be able to reduce the influence the cosmos had on Furs. After maintaining it for more than 10 seconds, the resplendent Milky Way's night sky slowly faded away. The stellar radiance then returned to Furz's body fused with her. At this moment, a deep darkness appeared in front of Furs. Deep in the darkness was a perpetual storm and occasionally flashing lightning. The next second, Furs heard a familiar voice. It stabbed into her head like steel nails, stirring her brain matter. Furs grimaced immediately. If she hadn't experienced such things over and over in the past, and had some level of resistance, as well as the fact that she was at the saint level, she would have likely lost control. Of course, there had to be some influence of good luck here. After a few seconds, she finally managed to calm herself down and hear what the voice was shouting by using cogitation. It was calling for help. It wasn't Jotun, Elvish or ancient Hermes. Instead, it was a language that Furs had never come into contact with before. However, she could understand it the moment she heard it. She felt like it was the true source of many languages. Mr. Door would crazily shout for help every full moon. How disgraceful of a king of angels. However, even if he is seeking help, it's still a terrifying thing that I can't withstand. Furs lampooned silently. She was considering if she should pretend not to hear it and wait until she had converged her spirituality and grasped the beyonder powers of a secret sorcerer before conversing with Mr. Door during the next full moon, or to do it now. Suddenly, the shouts from afar stopped and the surroundings became deathly silent. After 2 to 3 seconds, a wispy voice that could pierce through spirit bodies entered Furz's mind. You used the beyonder characteristics of the Abraham family. This sentence was said in a flat manner without any rise or fall, but it made the blood vessels on Furz's forehead throb. Her eyes turned bloodshot as her body turned resplendent. She almost lost control of herself. Who are you? Furs composed herself and asked deliberately. The voice that seemed to lure her into losing control said in a low smiling voice, You can call me Mr. Door. You should be familiar with me. The King of Angels from the 4th epoch directly pointed out that Furs had a certain connection with him. She could hear the full moon ravings, "I'm going to write you into a novel." Furs secretly gritted her teeth and asked, "Honorable Mr. Dorr, are you the ancestor of the Abraham family, Your Excellency Bethel?" The voice that had crossed countless barriers returned to its flatness. "Yes." "Then, do you know that your cry for help has caused the entire Abraham family to be trapped in a curse that has lasted for more than 1,000 years? It's basically impossible for anyone to become a traveler or even a scribe. They often lose control during advancements or the night of the full moon." Furs felt that she couldn't speak to Mr. Dorr for a long time, otherwise, her inclination towards losing control would be irreversible. She directly posed the question that the Abrahams were most concerned about. Mr. Dorr fell silent for 2 seconds before saying, "They no longer have secret sorcerer or demigods. There aren't any after the War of the 4 Emperors. And the curse you brought has made it impossible for them to advance to a demigod. If you can stop crying for help for 10 years, a new Abraham demigod might be born. This will greatly aid in your escape," Furs sincerely suggested. Mr. Dorr sighed and said, "I have been exiled to an eternal darkness, and suffer the blockage of a perpetual storm. I have no way to know what's happening in the real world, nor did I expect that there isn't a single demigod left in the entire Abraham family." Lies. The one who calmly made this conclusion wasn't Furs, but rather Klein, who had accommodated the fool's card as he held the staff of the stars while sitting in Sapphira Castle. He had been closely monitoring the corresponding crimson star. He remembered that the Emperor had mentioned in his diary that Mr. Dorr had a certain understanding of reality. He seemed to be able to use the changes brought about by the full moon to see the situation outside the seal. After sighing, Mr. Dorr continued, "Besides, I can't control the cries for help during the full moon." "Why?" Furs asked in surprise. Mr. Dorr said in an ethereal voice, "You're already a demigod, so you should know very well that the higher the sequence, the greater the threat of going mad. An ordinary angel, even those who can walk the land freely and do what they like, without needing to engage in any additional battles, could also be gradually influenced by the Beyonder characteristics and become less like themselves. They might even enter a half-crazy state. I'm a king of angels who has been exiled and sealed for more than 1,000 years, and I don't even have someone to communicate with. My not going crazy means that I'm sufficiently powerful and lucky. On each full moon, the madness in me will be strengthened. I can't control it and can only constantly call for help. So that's how it is. If I were locked up like this, I might have gone crazy in a few months. If I'm provided alcohol, newspapers, magazines, all kinds of books, and various delicacies, I can last a year, no, half a year." Furs nodded in enlightenment and asked in a perfunctory manner, "Is there anything I can do for you? How can the Abrahams dispel the curse?" Mr. Dorr fell silent for a few seconds before saying, "Set up a ritual and help me escape. That way, the curse will cease to exist. There are 2 rituals that can be used. One is to sacrifice 3 demigods that are respectively from the seer, apprentice, and marauder pathway. The other is to extract the blood of at least 99 Beyonders from the Abraham family. Use it to draw such a symbol, I'll tell them," Furs immediately replied. At the same time, she added inwardly, "That's if Mr. Fool permits it." Mr. Dorr laughed and said, "If I can escape because of this, I will help you become an angel." His voice became more ethereal and weaker, as though he was slowly returning to his original state as Furs' advancement came to an end. About 2 to 3 seconds later, Furs couldn't hear the sounds that slowly pushed her onto the path of losing control. The deep darkness and horrifying storms in front of her also vanished. However, before the scene completely faded away, Furs could vaguely see that, on a vast land formed from dark red rocks, there was an ancient building that resembled a pyramid erected there. Behind the building was a deep darkness and twinkling stars. It was completely different from the cosmos that she had seen as an astrologer on the ground. "What's this?" Furs shook her head and controlled her scattered thoughts as she began to carefully rein her spirituality back. After getting accustomed to the state of a secret sorcerer, she immediately took on a praying posture and reported her previous experiences to Mr. Fool without missing anything. After doing this, Furs put away the devil's oil painting, teleported back to Pritz Harbor, and met her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham, who was waiting in the warehouse. Seeing that his student was safe and sound, Dorian heaved a sigh of relief and said in a pious manner, "Thanks to Mr. Fool for his blessings." He had finally taught a sequence 4 secret sorcerer who didn't show signs of betrayal. Due to Mr. Fool's lack of response, Furs didn't inform her teacher of her conversation with Mr. Dor. She planned on waiting until the next full moon. She also relaxed and smiled. "Apart from thanking Mr. Fool, I have to thank you, teacher." In the ancient palace above the fog, Klein didn't have any doubts about Mr. Dor calling himself half-crazy. He only felt that there had to be more secrets hidden in the matter. For example, why did Mr. Dor keep enticing Emperor Roselle to visit the moon? It was a place that was occupied by an outer deity. After some thought, he took out the scarlet lunar corona and master key from the fog of history. He planned on creating a full moon environment and listening to Mr. Dor's shouting. The effects of the combination had long been confirmed. Klein quickly heard the voice that seemed to pierce through his spirit body. The content of the shouting was, "Don't save me. Don't save me." Chapter 1295 The Aftermath from the War's Frontlines, Don't Save Me. Don't Save Me. Being located in Sapphira Castle and having accommodated the Fool's card, Klein already had the status of a king of angels. He no longer suffered any direct corruption from Mr. Dor's cries, but the contents of the cries made his scalp tingle. His pupils dilated, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of horror surging in his heart. He originally believed that Mr. Dor was constantly shouting for help, but what he heard now was, "Don't save me." Amidst Klein's silence, the weak, wispy voice pierced through his spirit body like needles. After shouting for more than 10 seconds, it suddenly changed. "Help me. Help me." This time, there was a certain change in the language used. Klein expressionlessly leaned back into his chair and listened for nearly 10 seconds. Following that, he removed his control over the master key and the scarlet lunar corona's historical void projection, allowing the atmosphere of the space above the gray fog to completely return to silence. Phew. He exhaled as he tapped the edge of the long-modeled table out of habit and muttered to himself, "Mr. Dor is indeed half mad, but the mad part isn't the him who is desperately screaming, but the him who appears calm, the one that's able to communicate with people rationally. The latter can influence the former to a certain extent, distorting the contents of his shouts. When Mr. Dor is lucid, he actually shouts, 'Don't save me.' To a king of angels who had been imprisoned for more than 1,000 years, this definitely isn't a normal reaction. Unless he feels that he will bring a disaster that he doesn't wish to see upon returning to reality. A king of angels that has completely lost control? Together with Mr. Dor's communication with the Emperor, and how he had been constantly enticing him to visit the moon which is occupied by an outer deity. There is another possibility to this matter. Mr. Dor, who was exiled, lost the protection left behind by the original creator. He encountered the corruption of a particular outer deity and lost most of his rationality. His condition is only slightly better than the chained god. The apprentice pathway can wander the cosmos at sequence 3. Mr. Dor's honorific name also includes the title of Guide of the Endless Cosmos. Does this mean that before this king of angels was exiled, he might have already made contact with outer deities and came under some influence? Yes. What does Miss Magician's final glimpse of the Crimson Land, pyramid-like buildings, and cosmos in a different area represent? This doesn't seem like it's in the current solar system, but it's a little different from the mausoleum that a black emperor needs. It's the lair of some outer deity who affected Mr. Dor, or should I say that when Mr. Dor became a planeswalker and left legends behind on other planets with living beings, this is one of his anchor points? It's highly likely the latter, because when Miss Magician saw this scene, she didn't encounter any corruption from the cosmos. The more Klein thought about it, the heavier his heart became. This was because it was possible that this was a reflection of how the apocalypse would dawn. The apocalypse was definitely not something that wouldn't happen by not thinking about it or pretending not to know. It's no wonder Yellow Light Venethan had prophesied that the day when the curse is removed is the beginning of the true disaster for the Abrahams. Mr. Dor keeps calling for help, causing the Abraham family to be unable to produce another demigod. Perhaps it's a certain form of protection. Although this will make the Abraham family lose their status and most precious items, making them mediocre, it can at least save their bloodline. In the prophecy, the solution to resolving the curse is in the hands of an apprentice who has obtained the help of a secret existence. Klein chuckled softly and had an idea about the response to give Miss Magician. He planned on getting Furs to give a half-truth when informing her teacher. Firstly, it was to emphasize that Mr. Dor was already half-crazy and extremely dangerous. Even communicating with him implied tremendous risks. Secondly, it was to not mention the second ritual for the curse removal. All she would say was about the sacrificing of a seer, a marauder, and an apprentice demigod. With the first point, the Abrahams could understand why their ancestor was insistent on calling for help. This was because he had already lost his mind and could do all sorts of terrifying things. This could effectively eliminate the anxiety of the Abrahams, preventing them from helping Mr. Dor escape, and allowing them to quickly start believing in the fool. The second point was to dispel the small number of extreme Abrahams who wanted to try their luck. This was because they lacked the ability to complete such a ritual. At the same time, informing the Abrahams of the ritual increased the trust they had in Furs. Ignoring the small number of secret sorcerers available, those who can become bizarro sorcerers are definitely very difficult to capture. Furthermore, most of them are concentrated in the secret order. To deal with them is to provoke Zeradal. Even if the Abrahams have a demigod, and can use a grade 0 sealed artifact for a short period of time, it's impossible for them to complete the ritual so easily. Yes, dealing with a parasite is the most dangerous. If they aren't careful, they might end up targeting Amon's avatar. When that happens, it will be equivalent to serving Amon desserts. Also, I'll use the world's Gehrman Sparrow in the future to remind Miss Magician to keep her guard up against the Abraham family's extremists. Klein thought for a moment before replying Furz's prayer. After returning from the fog of history to the real world, Klein boarded a steam locomotive and arrived at the capital of Midseashire. In the past, it was the second largest city in Lone, and also the front line of the recent war, Constant City. The damage suffered here is very serious. After getting off the train and leaving the platform, Klein stood up high and looked at the industrial city. Although it was his first time here, he had seen all sorts of pictures of Constant in newspapers and magazines. Those photos were all black and white, and they recorded the various aspects of this city. Among them, there were 3 points that left a deep impression on Klein. Firstly, it was filled with chimneys and tall blast furnaces. It was as though it was a man-made forest. It gave a striking visual impact, one that was more representative of industry than Backlund. Secondly, the majority of the buildings used concrete and steel. They were more densely built than their counterparts in Backlund. Thirdly, there were many places that were stained with coal ashes, including the bodies of humans, but the air quality was better than Backlund because the sea breeze was strong. And now, the towering blast furnaces, chimneys, and tall buildings had become rather sparse. All that was left was a pile of ruins. However, in comparison, the damage dealt to the factory district was lesser than the residential areas. This was because there were many steel and military factories that were equally important to Fasak. The death toll here is definitely more than 100,000. Klein sighed inwardly. He carried his luggage and walked down the stairs to the steam locomotive station and entered Constant City. On the way to the hotel, he continued his acting as a miracle invoker and randomly chose a young, burly man in his 30s. I'm a wandering magician. My best magic trick is to grant anyone's wishes. Do you want to try it? The previously thin-skinned Klein was now able to strike up a conversation naturally. The burly man glanced at him and waved his hand impatiently. Can you let my father, mother, 2 brothers, and a child be revived? With that said, he didn't wait for the magician to respond as he walked towards the nearest public carriage station in a slightly irritable manner. He struck his left chest with his right fist. Klein stood where he was and maintained the smile on his lips as he quietly watched the man leave. He recalled a magazine he had read on a steam locomotive. It contained several pages of images reflecting the current state of each cemetery in Constant City. The tombstones were similar to the original chimneys and blast furnaces. The racks that held up urns of ashes resembled tall buildings that had collapsed. The entirety of Constant City seemed to be buried in a cemetery. Retracting his smile, Klein walked around the already dried-up fountain and walked to a nearby inn. Along the way, he heard many pedestrians discussing haunted places and the places with terrifying monsters. When I was passing by the Maris River, I heard a lot of people crying in the water. I didn't dare to look and ran back into the city like the wind. That's nothing. I saw something even scarier on 9 Hyacinth Street. There was a face plastered on the window there. A very pale face. A few passers-by disappeared behind my house, and the blood continued all the way to the nearest ruin, but the police couldn't find the bodies. How terrifying. May the goddess bless us. Holy Lord of Storms. Let these ghosts and monsters stay away from us. By the way, City Hall has posted an announcement that we are to report it to the police the moment such things are discovered. From the looks of it, the meat grinder-like war made it impossible to placate many corpses, allowing them to turn into ghosts. Most of the time, some of the dead might not even have their bodies left intact. Yes, there are definitely many Beyonders who lost control due to a mental breakdown or from losing their limbs. Also, most of those who didn't consume the potion according to the normal procedures also easily lose control. The Nighthawks and mandated punishers will definitely clear up these matters, but at least in Constant City, people might have encountered plenty of Beyonder matters for quite a long period of time. After all, some ghosts and monsters are good at evasion and hiding. They are innately very cunning. Klein walked straight and gained a new understanding of Constant's situation. Here, encountering supernatural events was no longer a coincidence. Instead, it was a daily occurrence with a certain probability. At this moment, Klein saw a group of Nighthawks wearing red gloves and black trench coats walk across the crossroad ahead of him. However, he didn't recognize any of them. Indeed, the Cathedral of Serenity has sent the Red Gloves team to help. What's happening nearby? Klein nodded indiscernibly and, following his spiritual intuition, cast his gaze to a particular apartment building behind a pile of ruins. On the 4th floor, behind an oriel window, a greatly rotting face was plastered to the window, looking out through the glass. Pale yellow liquid with black hints slid down the window one after another. Chapter 1296 Amateur astronomer Eric had become a captain of a Red Gloves team during the later stages of the war, as well as advancing to Sequence 5 Spirit Warlock. He had witnessed the deaths of the ex-captain and ex-ex-captain. He knew that a higher sequence wasn't a guarantee that he would be safer. Care and caution was what mattered. To the elite Red Gloves of the Nighthawks, this was a concept that almost everyone believed in. This was because ordinary Nighthawks might only encounter ordinary problems that looked like supernatural events. Occasionally, there would be slip-ups, and it was highly likely that they would rely on their Beyonder powers to turn the situation around. As for Red Gloves who worked on various important cases, their hidden targets were definitely rather dangerous. At that moment, Eric stood on the 4th floor of the apartment on 14 Priya Street. Facing the tightly shut dark brown wooden door, he surveyed the area and said, "2 Nighthawks have already gone missing here. We must not be careless." Initially, several residents of this apartment block reported it to the police. They claimed that Unit 403 had a stench, and the tenants of Unit 303 often heard heavy footsteps from above. The policeman in charge of the area took 2 days before coming to investigate. However, they didn't walk out of Unit 403. After the police confirmed this, they immediately transferred the case to the Church of Evernight. However, the 2 Nighthawks who came to deal with it also disappeared. The door to Unit 403 remained tightly shut. Due to this premise, the Church of Evernight's Archbishop of the Mid-Seashire Diocese entrusted the matter to Eric's team and allowed them to apply for a Grade 1 sealed artifact as support. "Yes, Captain." The members of the Red Gloves team either nodded or spoke in response. Eric didn't say anything else as he stood in front of the dark brown door of Unit 403 which remained tightly shut. He raised his red-gloved left hand and knocked on one of his teeth. A blurry figure suddenly appeared in front of him. As though it had no substance to it, it passed through the gap in the door and entered Unit 403. Eric's expression was unusually focused, as if he was observing the situation in the room through that blurry figure. It was a natural spirit that he controlled. It wasn't especially powerful, but it had special abilities. It usually lived on his left front tooth. Under the current situation, Eric believed that they shouldn't barge in directly. It was best to do reconnaissance first. Even if his team had a good mix of powers and a powerful sealed artifact to help them, they had to be cautious. If he could figure out the situation inside and prepare for it in a targeted fashion, he believed that things would be much easier. Right at this moment, tiny blood vessels protruded in Eric's eyes, and some of them even exploded. When his vision turned bright red, Eric heard a heavy creak. The dark brown door suddenly opened. There were a total of 6 figures in the room. 3 police officers wore black and white uniforms. They were sitting on high-back chairs, high stools, and the sofa. 2 of them were wearing half-top hats, black trench coats, of which one was standing by the door, and the other was standing behind the oriel window. His face was pressed to the surface of the glass as if he was watching the streets downstairs. There was also a figure sitting on a high stool at the edge of the balcony. In front of him was an exquisite astronomical telescope. The skin of the 6 figures began to swell, as though they had been injected with gas. Some parts of the body had even cracked and were highly decomposed, but they still hadn't dried up. They exuded a bluish-black glisten as light yellow liquid with hints of black flowed out. Sensing the door open, the 6 figures turned to look at Eric and the others. The first was the Nighthawk standing in front of the door. The last was the man wearing a cotton shirt behind the astronomical telescope. He had one of his eyeballs, its blacks and whites separated clearly, glued to the telescope's lens, allowing him to only use his remaining black, empty socket to scan the Red Gloves team outside. A faint stench drilled into the noses of Eric and the others as an indescribable coldness filled the surroundings. Eric instinctively raised his hand to hit his teeth, releasing more spirits. Then, he used his Nightmare Beyonder powers to forcefully drag all his targets into a dream. However, no matter how he tapped his teeth, he didn't release his soul. His Spirit Warlock Beyonder powers seemed to have vanished instantly. At the same time, a nightmare in the Red Gloves team also discovered in surprise that he was unable to pull someone into a dream. At that moment, apart from the enhancement in their physique brought by the potion, their Beyonder powers mysteriously vanished. "Leave this place," Eric ordered without hesitation. He had never encountered such a strange situation before. All he could do was get the team to retreat first before choosing a sealed artifact to handle the situation in a targeted manner. However, he and his team members didn't move despite his orders. It was as though their bodies were no longer taking orders. Eric instinctively lowered his head and looked at his lower body. His legs were swollen and his pants were torn. In addition, he could clearly feel that his skin was decaying, rotting, and running with pus. He and his Red Gloves team had yet to truly come into contact with their target, but they had fallen into a nightmare of watching themselves die, swell, and rot bit by bit with no way to escape. Right at this moment, Eric's bloodshot eyes reflected a normal palm. He held the handle and gently pulled it. Thud. The dark brown door of Unit 403 closed once again, separating Eric and his Red Gloves team from the creatures in the room. They instantly regained control over their bodies. However, their legs seemed to have suffered significant injuries. It was a little difficult to move them, be it raising their feet or bending their knees. Eric didn't bother checking on his injuries. He quickly cast his gaze on the palm that closed the door, and its owner. It was a young man wearing an ancient hat and a long black robe. His facial features were ordinary, making it impossible for one to have a deep impression of him. It was a face that one forgot in seconds. I sincerely advise you to return now and leave the matter to the Archbishop or high-ranking deacons to handle. Of course, you have another choice. That is to ask me to grant a wish. I'm a wandering magician named Merlin Hermes. My specialty is granting the wishes of others. Klein spared no effort in enticing others to make a wish. When he saw the rotting face on the oriel window earlier, he suddenly had an ominous feeling, so he specially came over to confirm what had happened. Grant wishes. Eric recalled the education he had received during his training in the Holy Cathedral. A high-sequence beyonder might be in a state of being imprisoned or sealed. They will pretend to be mystical items that can grant wishes, and they will entice you into helping them escape. The corresponding examples include granting 3 wishes and wishing pools. Is this a high-sequence beyonder? But he doesn't look like he's imprisoned or sealed. Eric looked left and right and deliberated for a few seconds before probing. If we don't ask you to grant us our wishes, will you not resolve the abnormality in the room? As soon as he finished speaking, he saw the wandering magician who called himself Merlin Hermes fall deep in thought, looking a little troubled. A few seconds later, Klein raised his hand to stroke his tall top hat. He smiled and sighed. Even if you don't make the wish, I will still attempt to resolve it. Do I need to read your honorific name or your true name to have my wish granted? Eric asked after exchanging glances with his team members. Klein shook his head. No, just tell me your wish. This wouldn't create a mysticism connection. Eric probed in a joking tone, then I wish the abnormalities in this room will be resolved and will no longer affect the surroundings. Klein curled his smile and gently clapped his hands. Your wish will come true. Without waiting for Eric to respond, he smiled and said, the abnormalities inside can suppress beyonder characteristics, causing the corresponding powers to be ineffective, but that isn't absolute. Typically in such cases, my suggestion is, as he spoke, Klein reached out with his left hand and took out an eyeball-shaped glass ball. He then twisted the handle with his right hand, opening the door a little. Then, through a crack, he threw the glass ball into Unit 403. As the glass ball flew, it constantly absorbed the surrounding light and gave off a brilliant, pure, extreme sunlight that resembled a miniature sun. The next second, Klein closed the door with his right palm, lest Eric and company's eyes couldn't take it. My suggestion is to use a Grade 1 sealed artifact in the Sun domain to purify the entire area. While saying that, Klein recalled the mutated Sun sacred emblem behind Tingen City's Chinese gate. Although it was only a Grade 3 sealed artifact, it could still deal with the rotting creatures inside given enough time. Just as Eric was about to say that they had brought a similar sealed artifact, but just didn't have the chance to use it, he saw Mr. Merlin Hermes open the door to Unit 403. The 6 figures inside had vanished into thin air, and the different beyonder characteristics were slowly condensing. The originally cold and sinister stench had been completely melted by the warm feeling. "It's been resolved?" Eric asked after some hesitation. Klein shook his head with a smile. "No, the root of the problem is still here." "Have you investigated the owner of this place?" Eric replied immediately. "He calls himself John, an amateur astronomer. He likes to study the cosmos using specialized telescopes at night." Studying the cosmos. Klein walked into the room without batting an eyelid, and he casually instructed, "Search the area and find any possible clues." For some reason, Eric suddenly felt that Mr. Merlin Hermes was the captain from back when he first joined the Nighthawks. He was professional, calm, and trustworthy. He nodded at his team members, signaling them to follow his instructions. As for him, he continued following Klein. It was both to provide him help, and also for necessary precautions. Klein ignored him as he swept his gaze and approached the exquisite astronomical telescope. Then, he bent down and drew his eyes towards the lens. This might be dangerous. Eric had planned to warn him, but he fell silent when he thought about how high the other party's level and status expressed. At that moment, through the telescope, Klein saw a resplendent, dreamlike dark night sky. Every star there was blinking slightly. Suddenly, his vision was occupied by a huge eye. The eye seemed to be directly attached to the lens on the other end of the telescope. It was grayish-white with a pale yellow iris. Veins swelled outwards and seeped out disgusting translucent pus. Chapter 1297, Forest of Miracles Boom. The Red Gloves captain, Eric, shivered involuntarily as he saw Merlin Hermes, who claimed to be a wandering magician, explode behind the telescope. However, there was no splattering blood or flesh. The shredded limbs disappeared into the air like soap bubbles. Eric and his team members, who looked over due to the commotion, were stunned. They didn't understand the reason behind such a sudden sequence of events. A second later, Eric said in a deep voice, "Retreat." He wanted to evacuate his team before the danger truly spread. At this moment, another figure walked in from the open door of Unit 403. It was none other than Merlin Hermes, who had just exploded. This wandering magician was wearing a tall hat and a long black robe. As if nothing had happened, he spoke to Eric and his team members. "The root of the problem really is from that telescope." As he spoke, Klein walked to the balcony and tapped the telescope with his right hand. Another bang rang out as the telescope suddenly shattered into metallic points of light that emitted a foul stench of bluish-black gas. The moment the grayish-white fog appeared, the stench vanished and the room returned to normal. What exactly happened? Eric forced himself to forget about the other party's death and asked cautiously. As a captain of the Red Gloves who was rather experienced, he had some guesses about the truth of the matter. The main goal of asking was to seek confirmation. Klein smiled and said, "Simply put, the telescope mutated for some reason, causing the owner of the room to see something that he shouldn't have seen. If you want to understand more details, you can only search for clues yourself." "I'm not too sure either." Eric nodded slightly and cast his gaze at his team members, signaling them to continue their investigation. After a series of work, Eric said to Merlin Hermes, "There aren't many clues left in the room. We can only confirm a few things. 1. John is a local resident, and he served in the military during the war. It seems that he had some mental problems as a result. 2. He had been an amateur astronomer. At the end of the war, he joined an academic organization known as the Celestial Research Association, but we didn't obtain any information about this organization. 3. John was seeking the way to see the true cosmos." Upon mentioning the word cosmos, Eric paused slightly, as though he had received a warning from the upper echelons of the Church of Evernight. He joined an organization known as the Celestial Research Association after the war ended. Sought the way to see the true cosmos. Klein combined this knowledge with his experience, and had a certain level of confidence in the matter. He nodded and said, "You should know that the cosmos means danger. You can't even try to understand it. We will report this case to the Archbishop as soon as possible and classify the Celestial Research Association as a dangerous organization," Eric said, as if speaking to a Nighthawk superior who wasn't directly in charge of him. Klein didn't respond as he walked to the door and sighed. Indeed, war really does have an irreversible impact on all aspects. After the fall of the god of combat, the already crumbling barrier set up by the Primordial One lost parts of its support. As for the Evernight goddess, she has yet to fully gain control of the corresponding uniquenesses. As for becoming a Great Old One, who knows how much longer that will take. Under such circumstances, the intrusion of the outer deities into this world would naturally deepen. This has combined with the damage that many ordinary people have suffered from the war. Klein suspected that, during the subsequent period of rebuilding after the war, many cults that pointed to the different outer deities or cosmos would appear secretly in Lone. If he allowed them to spread their faith and attempt various risky attempts, the apocalypse would definitely be brought forward. As he sighed, he walked out of Unit 403. His figure blurred, turning transparent until he disappeared. In a hotel near Priya Street, Klein, who had long since moved in, picked up the coffee in front of him and took a sip. Taking advantage of the fact that it was still early, he went out once again and took a carriage to the outskirts of the coastal Constant City. There was a cemetery. The stone tablets stood erect like a short forest. Klein walked through the cemetery and found a tombstone with the help of his spirituality. The name on the tombstone wrote, Welch McGovern. This was the original Klein's university schoolmate. As he had bought the Antigonus family's notebook, he had mysteriously died in Tianjin. This had indirectly caused Zhou Mingrue to transmigrate. Welch McGovern's father was a banker in Constant City. He had spent money to bring his son's corpse back to his hometown and buried it in this cemetery. Klein stared at the photo on the tombstone for a few seconds. He bent down and placed the bouquet of white flowers in his hand in front of Welch's grave. Just as he was about to turn and leave, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. 20 to 30 seconds later, an old man with a black cane walked over from another direction. Klein recognized him and knew that he was Welch's father. He was the Mid-Seashire County banker who had once invited him and his schoolmates to a sumptuous meal. However, compared to a few years ago, this gentleman had aged significantly. He was originally a very energetic middle-aged gentleman, but now, his hair was half white. There were many wrinkles on his eyes, mouth, and forehead. "Who are you?" Welch's father looked at the stranger in front of the grave. He asked, puzzled and wary. Klein sighed and said, "Mr. McGovern, I'm Welch's friend. I just happened to pass by Constant City recently." Welch's father nodded slightly and said in a deep voice, "He's a very sociable person. I only know a number of his friends." His words were an attempt to explain why he hadn't invited Klein to the funeral and how sorry he was. Klein didn't say anything else as he looked around and said, "Is there anything you need help with? Or do you have any wishes that you wish to have fulfilled? I hope I can provide you with some strength." Welch's father looked around and smiled bitterly. "Can you allow all the dead here to stand up again? It's not impossible, but they will be different from what you have in mind." Klein sighed and shook his head. "Then can you allow Constant to return to its original state?" Welch's father asked with a bitter smile. Without waiting for Klein's reply, he sighed and continued, "There's no need to provide any help. I can achieve what is possible myself. If it's impossible, then I can only pray to the deities." As he spoke, the banker went past Klein and walked to his son's tombstone. He bent down and put down the bouquet of white flowers. Klein looked at his back and muttered to himself, "I will try my best." With that, he turned around and left the cemetery. Constant City, in a bar with a style that resembled the previous centuries. A man donning a thick jacket carried his beer and walked to a wooden board beside the bar counter. He tried to find a part-time job on the notices pasted on it. Suddenly, he saw a strange mission: I'm a reporter. I want to gather all kinds of stories from different people. It's best if you had personally experienced it yourself. The remuneration I can provide is to satisfy your wish to repair and rebuild your house for free. I have sufficient resources in this aspect. Merlin Hermes. The man subconsciously frowned. He felt that this request was too strange, like it was a prank. Can you read the words on it? A thin man who was sitting beside the wooden board took the opportunity to ask. Few patrons of this bar were literate. Even if they wanted to find a job, or accept the corresponding commissions, most people were unable to understand the notices on the wooden board, and the bartender could only remember the few with the highest pay. As a result of this situation, the thin, feeble man relied on the common Loanese terms he learned at the free schools to provide the corresponding interpretation at a quarterpence. This was how he made a living. The man shook his head, indicating that he understood Loanese. He pointed at Merlin Hermes' request and said, "Is this real?" "It is. That reporter is sitting by that corner, the one wearing a very tall hat." The thin, feeble man enthusiastically pointed him in the correct direction. The reporter had promised him a quarterpence for every person he introduced. The man holding the beer fell silent. After hesitating for a full 10 seconds, he walked to the corner and found the reporter named Merlin Hermes. Will you really help me rebuild my house?" he asked worriedly. Klein pointed at the documents on the small round table and said, "We can sign a contract." "There's no need. Even if you provide some materials, I'll still be very satisfied." The man sat opposite Klein and said rather cautiously, "I don't have a very touching story. As long as it's real enough." Klein nodded slightly in encouragement. The man looked down and stared at the table. "I'm a constant native, and I used to have a decent job. I bought a terrace house along Loteed Street. Later, war broke out. My house was reduced to ruins during one of the bombings. My eldest son, the child who just entered primary school, was buried inside. We had no choice but to rent a 2-bedroom room until the Phasacians occupied Constant. They dragged my wife away and she never returned. Some time ago, someone requested me to identify her corpse. I couldn't even recognize her. She had rotten so much that you wouldn't even call it a corpse. However, in the pockets of her clothes, there was still our old water bill. When she was still at the rental apartment, she had always missed our home. It's the same for my younger daughter. I don't have much money now and can only barely maintain my life, but I wish to rebuild that house bit by bit. To be honest, I don't like telling others about my misfortune. I'd rather stay silent. But if I can really get help with the rebuilding efforts, then I can." Klein held a pen and paper and pretended to jot it down. He nodded gently and said, "Your wish will come true. Wait for me in front of the ruins of that house on Loteed Street tomorrow." At the same time, he pushed a 1 soldi note over. "This is for your drinks. My treat." The man's eyes flickered. He seemed to want to refuse it, but in the end, he still picked up the note. The next day, after sending his younger daughter to the church school, he walked along the familiar path to the familiar Loteed Street and saw that familiar house. Its chimney, its windows, its door, and the weeds on its walls hadn't changed at all. It was so familiar, as if its beautiful female owner would open the door in the next second and walk the 2 children out to welcome their father. The man was stunned, unable to believe that this was real. However, even if it was an illusion, he was willing to embrace it. After several days, Klein, who had completed a slew of similar wishes, pushed open the window of the hotel and snapped his fingers in the morning light fog. In an area of the city overlooking Constant, Welch's father woke up out of habit due to his dreams of his dead son and family. He walked to the balcony to take in the morning air. Under the light of dawn, he suddenly saw chimneys and blast furnaces that resembled a forest. Alongside them were tall buildings. The former constant city had presented itself to him, bathed in the orange light of dawn. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.